He built an empire on the bones of kings who underestimated him. Then he made the same mistake himself, with a woman standing 3 feet away. Valor Draven severed the bond, exiled his Luna before dawn, and turned back to his throne without watching her carriage disappear into the snow. He thought that was the end of it. He thought wrong. Every conqueror carries a blind spot. His walked out the gate on quiet feet and rebuilt herself into something the world had never seen. Stay until the end, because this one will break you open. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. Gatsien. The throne hall of Ironfang smelled like iron and ambition, which was fitting because both things corroded if you left them unattended. Celine Vera knew the smell well. She had lived inside it for 3 years, moving through Vialor Draven's court the way water moves through rock. Not fast, not loud, not noticed, but always finding the cracks. Tonight the hall blazed with victory torches. Black banners hung from the vaulted obsidian ceiling, heavy with rain and wolf blood from the northern campaign, and the assembled court of Ironfang filled the space beneath them the way predators fill a pen, pressing close to power, jostling for position, watching each other's hands. Celine stood at the edge of the raised dais, 3 steps below Valor's throne, in the place designated for the Luna. She wore ivory wool, plain cut, with no embroidery and no jewels save the slim silver band around her wrist that marked the mating bond. Her hair was pulled back without ornament. Around her, noble women glittered in jewels and silk. Beside her, the court looked like a fire she had not been invited to warm herself beside. She was accustomed to that. She was accustomed to many things. General Crest was speaking now, his barrel chest pushing out with the effort of projecting his voice to the hall's far reaches. He was recounting the fall of Fort Hallow in the northern campaign, embellishing in exactly the places Celine had noticed he always embellished. The moments of personal courage that he had not, based on the casualty reports, actually been present for. She had read those reports. She read everything that passed through the administrative wing. The palace clerks had stopped noticing her in their corridors long ago, and clerks talked more freely when they believed no one important was listening. And when the beta wall broke, Crest was saying, his voice rising toward ceremony, our king drove through it alone. 100 enemy wolves and Alpha King Draven put every last one of them into the ground. The court erupted. Fists struck tables. Wolves stamped boots against stone. Valor sat his throne through all of it with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that power performs itself best in silence. He was large the way mountains are large, not dramatically so from any single angle, but undeniably, structurally dominant in a room. Dark hair, jaw like forged metal, eyes the color of storm water over slate. He was 31 years old and had worn a crown since 22. He had the posture of someone who had not questioned his right to occupy the highest point in any room he entered. Celine had spent 3 years learning his patterns, the way you study a river before you have to cross it. She knew his tells, the slight forward tilt when he was working a decision in real time, the way his right hand opened and closed when something in his peripheral vision was bothering him, the particular quality of silence that preceded calculated cruelty versus the different quality that preceded genuine consideration. She noticed, watching him now through the torch smoke and the noise of his celebrating court, that his right hand was open and closing. Someone in this room was bothering him. She tracked his gaze the way she had learned to track everything, without appearing to move her eyes, and found it. Standing near the eastern archway, half in shadow and half not, was a woman Celine did not recognize. This in itself was notable. Celine recognized everyone. The woman was tall, dark-haired, built with the coiled readiness of someone trained to fight, dressed not in court silks but in deep burgundy that suggested military connection without declaring it. She watched Vialor the way a merchant watches something they intend to acquire. Celine filed her away and said nothing. She said nothing about most things. The celebration stretched for 2 hours. Wine moved in rivers. The cook sent out boar and venison and something heavily spiced from the eastern kitchens. Celine ate sparingly and watched. 3 Lord Advisors changed seating positions to be closer to General Crest once it became clear Valor was acknowledging him tonight. Lord Fenwick, whose grain contracts came up for renewal in the spring, laughed too loudly at Crest's jokes, a sound like something metal being dropped. Lady Oren, married, 3 children, widely understood to be conducting correspondence with the Halrath border lord that she did not want her husband to see. stood near the window at an angle that gave her a clear view of the door and a reason to face away from the room. Everyone in Ironfang's court was managing something. Everyone had a ledger of vulnerabilities. Selene knew most of them. She had never used a single one. She was beginning to understand that her patience in this matter was approaching its natural limit. Vahelor rose from the throne at the second hour, which was his custom. He did not stay until the celebration collapsed into drinking songs and sleeping lords, because maintaining mystique required not being the last man standing at a party. The court quieted in that way it always did when he moved, a wave of silence that traveled ahead of him through the room. He passed Selene without speaking, which was also not unusual. In public, the Alpha King and his Luna moved in parallel, close enough to signal unity, far enough apart to make clear who the gravitational center was. She fell into step 2 paces behind him, as was expected, and followed him from the hall into the corridor of carved stone that connected the throne room to the private wing. The torches here were spaced farther apart. Vahelor walked with a deliberateness that told her he was thinking about something and not about her, specifically. His boots struck stone. Her softer shoes were nearly silent behind him. "The woman in Burgundy," Selene said. He stopped. She had learned the precise economy of language required to insert herself into his attention. Too many words, and he tuned them out the way he tuned out anything that repeated itself. Too few, and he did not bother to follow the thread. She had calibrated this over time, the way you calibrate a blade. "What about her, Dick?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like permission being considered. She arrived during the second watch. No lord announced her. The guard at the eastern arch accepted something from her hand before he let her through. She spent the celebration with her back to the wall and her eyes on you specifically. She did not eat, and she did not drink. She watched your generals with the same attention as she watched you, which means she is not here for personal interest. She is here to evaluate military structure. Vahelor turned around. His expression was not readable, in the way that all thoroughly developed competence conceals its workings from casual observation. He looked at Selene for a moment with an attention that she recognized as genuine, the real kind, not the performed acknowledgement he distributed in court. "You know her," he said. "I know of her lineage. Isolde Marrow, war daughter of Duke Marrow of the Eastern Reach. The Duke controls 3 deep water ports and has been in informal negotiation with the Silvercrest Kingdoms for the past year. Isolde served as his military attaché until 8 months ago, when she disappeared from public record. The Eastern trade dispatches I read last month mentioned a new private military force operating out of the Marrow coastal territories. No flag, no declared allegiance." The silence in the corridor was particular. "You read the Eastern trade dispatches," Vahelor said. "The administrative clerks receive them on the 4th day of each month. Lord Fenwick's secretary leaves them in the sorting room until he collects them. It is not a secured room." Something moved through Vahelor's expression that she could not fully name. It was not quite suspicion, not quite assessment, something that lived between those two things, in the uncomfortable space of encountering a fact you had not accounted for. "Why?" he said. "Why do I read them? Why are you telling me this?" Selene held his gaze. Around them the corridor breathed with distant torch smoke and the muffled noise of the celebration still rolling through the hall behind them. "Because she's not here to celebrate your victory," Selene said. "She's here to price what it's worth to her." Vahelor looked at her for another moment, and in it Selene read everything she always read in the pauses he gave her. The faint, persistent surprise of a man who kept encountering evidence that the person he had categorized as decorative was not, in fact, purely decorative, and who kept choosing to categorize her the same way regardless. "Go to your chambers," he said. She went. She did not do so because she had no other options. She did so because of all the things she had learned in 3 years in Ironfang's court. The most important was this. There was no productive argument to be made to a man who had already decided who you were. Arguments spent themselves against that kind of certainty the way water spends itself against stone. You did not move the stone by arguing with it. You moved it by changing the landscape around it. She was still building the landscape. She had time, or she believed she had time. Selene's chambers were in the eastern tower, pleasant but not prominent, with a window that looked over the stable yards rather than the ceremonial gardens. She had chosen this view herself when she arrived at Ironfang, which had confused the chamberlain, who assumed it was a mistake. She had not corrected him. The stable yards told her more about the Empire's functioning in a single morning than the ornamental gardens told her in a year. Horses moved in patterns. Their condition told you about supply chains and travel distances. The grooms talked while they worked, the kind of honest talk that people produce when they believe they are unobserved. She had learned more about Iron Fang's actual military posture from 3 years of watching the stable yards than she had from any official report. She sat at her desk and opened the correspondence she had been composing before the celebration called her to the hall. 3 letters, each in a different hand. She had practiced the hands carefully over the past year, addressed to different trade contacts in the Southern Territories, each one innocent individually. Together they carried information in a cipher she had built herself over the long, silent months of her first year in Ironfang, when she had understood that silence was not safety, but merely a different kind of preparation. She was not betraying Ironfang. She was corresponding with people she trusted in ways she needed to trust them, because she was the last surviving heir of a bloodline that had enemies she had not yet fully mapped, and correspondence was how you maintained the network that kept you alive when the formal structures around you failed. She finished the 3rd letter, sealed it with plain wax, and set it with the others to go out with the morning courier under unremarkable cover. Then she went to the window and watched the stable yard in the dark, where a groom was walking a horse with a loose foreleg, the animal's breath clouding in the cold air, and she thought about Isolde Marrow. She had not told Vaylor everything she knew about Isolde Marrow. She had told him enough to be useful, not enough to expose how thoroughly she had already understood what Isolde represented. Isolde was an offer, a larger offer than Vaylor currently understood, and Vaylor was a man who responded to scale. The question, the one Celine had been sitting with for the 3 weeks since she had first pieced together who the woman in the Eastern Trade Dispatches was whether the landscape she was building would be ready in time. She did not sleep well that night. The summons came 4 days later, not to her chambers and not through the normal channels of court protocol. A guard she did not recognize appeared at the eastern tower door at mid-morning with a verbal message and nothing written. Vaylor's personal guard did that sometimes when he wanted no paper trail, instructing her to attend a private meeting in the map room at the second afternoon bell. The map room was where Vaylor made the decisions he did not want witnessed, not strategy sessions with generals, which happened in the war hall, not administrative matters, which happened in the official council chamber. The map room was for the particular kind of decision that a king made alone or nearly alone before announcing it to the world as already settled. Celine had been in the map room twice in 3 years. Once when Vaylor was planning the northern campaign and wanted to discuss supply routes, a conversation in which he had listened to her for 12 minutes before arriving at conclusions she had already outlined in the first 3, which told her something specific about his relationship to advice from her. Once when the previous court physician had died and Vaylor was deciding on the replacement, and he had brought her in, she understood, not for her opinion, but to observe whether she reacted to any of the candidates in ways that would reveal private knowledge. She had revealed nothing. She dressed that afternoon in the same plain style she always wore and went to the map room at the second bell, and when she arrived she found not only Vaylor but Isolde Marrow. The woman was even more striking in direct light than she had been in shadow. She had the kind of confidence that lived in the body, in posture and stillness, and the way she occupied space without taking inventory of whether she was entitled to. She wore deep red, well cut, with no military insignia but the posture of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person present. She looked at Celine with the professional assessment of someone evaluating a potential complication and determining within seconds that the complication was manageable. Celine kept her hands still at her sides and her face neutral, which she was very good at, and took her place at the edge of the room. Vaylor did not look at her. He was leaning over the central map table, one hand flat on the spread chart of the Eastern Territories, and he had the expression he wore when he had already arrived at a decision and was rehearsing its delivery. "Lady Marrow has come with a proposal," he said. "So I see," Celine said. Isolde's mouth curved. It was not precisely a smile. "I'll speak plainly," Isolde said. "Ironfang's northern expansion is impressive, but the eastern sea routes are where the real imperial wealth sits, and without deep-water port access, your empire taps out at the mountain range. My family controls those ports. My family also controls 3 standing armies and intelligence networks in 4 kingdoms." She paused. "I'm proposing an alliance." "Through what mechanism?" Celine said. Both Vaylor and Isolde looked at her. Vaylor with the particular quality of surprise he occasionally allowed onto his face when she spoke in rooms where he had not expected her to. Isolde with a recalibration, small but visible. Political union, Isolde said after a moment, between Iron Fang and the Marrow territories, formalized in the traditional way. The silence that followed was one of the most particular Celine had ever stood inside. She understood what was being said. She understood it with precise clarity, the way you understand things you have been preparing to understand. She looked at Valor. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the map. "This is why you called me here," Celine said. Not a question. "You should hear it directly," Valor said. His voice was controlled. That was always how he managed things he had already decided. Controlled delivery, as if the control itself were a courtesy. "Then I have heard it directly." Celine kept her own voice even. "What do you need from me in this room?" "Nothing," Valor said. "I needed you to understand what is coming before it is announced." There it was. She had built the landscape, but not fast enough. She looked at the map on the table, the spread of territories, the eastern sea routes Isolde had referenced, the ports that Iron Fang could not currently reach, and she understood the decision Valor had made with the part of his mind that processed scale and acquisition above all other considerations. She also understood something he did not. He was about to make the most expensive error of his reign, and he did not know it yet, and she was the only person alive who had the information to tell him so. "The Marrow ports," Celine said, still looking at the map. "What about them?" Valor said. "They're not Marrows to offer." The quality of the silence changed. Isolde turned fully to face Celine. The professional assessment was back, but sharper now, recalibrating again. "I hold the deed of title," Isolde said, "granted by my father. Your father's title to the eastern ports was contested 18 months ago by the Velt Consortium, which filed with the Merchant Court at Ashvale. The Merchant Court at Ashvale issued a provisional ruling last autumn in the consortium's favor pending final arbitration, which is not scheduled until next spring. Your father accepted a private payment from the Silvercrest Kingdoms 4 months ago to stay out of the arbitration, which is why he no longer controls that outcome." Celine finally looked up from the map. "The ports are in active litigation. Marrying into them gives Iron Fang a disputed title, an arbitration proceeding, and 3 enemies before the Alliance produces a single ship." The room was very quiet. Valor was looking at her now. "That's a significant claim," he said. "The arbitration records are public at Ashvale. The Silvercrest payment is documented in the merchant bank ledgers there, which the clerks can pull. It would take 3 weeks to verify." "It would take 3 weeks I don't have," Isolde said, her voice controlled but with an edge that had not been there before. "This is a strategic delay tactic." "It is verifiable information," Celine said. "Whether you delay on it is Iron Fang's decision, not mine." Valor straightened from the map. He was calculating. She could see it happening, the internal machinery of his decision-making working against the new variable she had just introduced. She had given him a reason to pause, and she had given it in language he respected. Documentation, verification, concrete risk. "We'll pause the formal announcement," he said. "Valor," Isolde said. 3 weeks. If the records say what she says they say, we renegotiate the terms. If they don't, we proceed." He looked at Celine. "Get the inquiry to Ashvale today." "I'll write it before supper," Celine said. She left the map room and walked back toward the eastern tower, through corridors that smelled of stone and old smoke, and she allowed herself, inside the privacy of her own chest, a specific kind of exhaustion that she did not permit herself to show anywhere else. She had bought 3 weeks. She did not yet know if 3 weeks was enough. She did not yet know what she was buying them for, precisely, except that the port litigation was real, and Isolde Marrow's alliance was built on a cracked foundation, and the landscape she was building required more time than the timetable had given her. She sent the inquiry to Ashvale. She also sent a letter that was not about port litigation, through a different channel, to a contact in the Southern Territories who had been waiting for it for 6 months. The 3 weeks passed. The records from Ashvale confirmed everything Celine had described, which should have been a resolution, or at least a renegotiation, except that Isolde Marrow was not a woman who lost ground quietly. She adapted. Within a week of the Ashvale records arriving, she had restructured her proposal. Rather than bringing the ports to the Alliance, she would bring the standing armies directly, with the port litigation resolved as a secondary matter. She had also, in the time that the 3 weeks had given her, spent considerable energy inside the Iron Fang court. Celine watched this happen with the attention she applied to everything. Isolde was skilled at the specific social work of reframing absence into presence. She had managed to insert herself into 4 major court gatherings in 3 weeks, each time in a different configuration. Dinner guest here, military consultation there, observed in private conversation with 2 of Veilor's senior generals, in a location that was not quite private enough to be invisible. She wore different colors each time, each one a specific signal to a specific audience. She was building her own landscape, and she had resources Celine did not have: money, armies, and the particular currency of novelty. Courts responded to newness the way fires respond to air. The morning the revised proposal was scheduled to be presented to the full council, Celine received a message from a contact she had not heard from in 14 months. The message was short. It arrived through the Stableyard Courier, which was the second-tier channel, which meant urgency without crisis. The message said, "They found another one." Celine read it twice, sitting at her desk with the cold morning light coming through the stableyard window, and felt something shift in her chest that was less like fear and more like a calculation completing. They had found another one. She had spent 14 months believing she was the last, the sole survivor of a bloodline that powerful people had decided should not continue to exist. She had spent those 14 months building quietly and carefully inside Iron Fang's walls, using its resources and its information networks to build something outside them, and she had done it on the assumption that she was doing it alone. She was not, apparently, alone. Which changed the mathematics, which changed the timeline, which meant the landscape she had been building might be ready faster than she had calculated. She folded the message and pressed it into the heat of the small candle on her desk until it caught, then held it until it was ash. Then she went to the full council meeting and sat in her place 3 steps below Veilor's chair, plain dressed and silent, while Isolde Marrow presented her revised military alliance proposal to the assembled lords and generals of Ironfang, and she listened to the room's response with the particular quality of attention she had developed over 3 years of listening to rooms. The room was receptive. More than receptive. She heard it in the way the questions were pitched, not challenging, not skeptical, but the kind of questions that were building toward a conclusion rather than probing toward one. General Crest asked about the army deployment structure in a tone that said he already approved of the answer. Lord Fenwick's grain contract anxiety apparently did not extend to military matters. 3 of the junior lords watched Isolde with the fixed attention of men who were deciding how to position themselves relative to a new power center. Celine looked at Veilor. He had his hand flat on the armrest of the chair, not opening and closing. Flat and still, which was different. Flat and still meant settled. It meant decided. She understood. He had already made the decision. The council was a performance of process. The Ashvale setback had delayed him, but not changed him, because Isolde had used the delay well, and because Vialor ultimately responded to scale, and the armies Isolde was now offering were 3 standing forces that did not come with litigation complications. She had lost the 3 weeks, not the battle of information, that she had won, and it had bought time, but the larger thing. The thing she had been trying to slow down long enough to build around. She sat very still and let herself understand the shape of it. When the council ended and the lords filed out in the particular satisfied shuffle of men who have agreed to something they believe benefits them, Veilor remained. He said nothing for a moment, which was how he always started the conversations he found uncomfortable, with the silence, using it to arrange himself. The Ashvale records were accurate, he said. Yes. The ports are still in litigation. Yes? The revised proposal removes the port question from the primary alliance structure. It does. Veilor looked at her. The quality of the look was one she recognized because it was rare. It was the look he gave things he was genuinely wrestling with, rather than the look he gave things he had already resolved and was presenting as being wrestled with. You think it's a mistake, he said. I think the 3 standing armies are real, Celine said carefully. I think Isolde Marrow is capable, and the military alliance has genuine value for Ironfang's eastern expansion. I think the port litigation is a complication that will resurface. I think the Silvercrest connection is more significant than it appears, and I would want to understand it better before formally aligning with the Marrow name. Those are measured concerns, Veilor said. They are what I know and what I don't know yet. They're not enough to stop this. She held his gaze. No, she said. They're not. He was telling her something, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it explicit in that moment, the way that some truths exist in a room without being spoken, because speaking them would require acknowledging what they cost. The announcement was made the following morning, not to the full court, that would come in stages, but to the senior lords and the senior generals, assembled in the throne hall with the same black banners and the same iron smell. And Valor delivered it with the controlled authority of a man announcing the next phase of a campaign, alliance between Ironfang and the Marrow territories. Formalized through marriage. No one looked at Celine. She had learned long ago that when the court did not look at someone, it was because looking would require acknowledging something awkward, and Ironfang's court was skilled at collective avoidance. She kept her face neutral and her hands still, and stood in her place until the announcement finished, and then she did something she had never done in 3 years of court proceedings. She did not wait for the assembled lords to begin their congratulations and their positioning. She did not wait for the natural end of the gathering. She turned and walked out. No one stopped her. No one spoke. She walked back through the corridors to the eastern tower, and she sat at her desk, and she looked at the stable yard where a groom was loading travel packs onto a courier horse with the efficient movements of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and she let herself feel the specific texture of what this moment actually was. Not surprise. She had not been surprised in a long time. Not grief exactly, though there was something in the vicinity of it. The particular weight of a thing you had half prepared yourself to lose arriving as confirmed loss. She had known for months that Valor could not see her. She had known it the way you know things that live in the body before they reach the mind. The knowledge had sat in her chest for all the long evenings in this room, while she read dispatches and wrote coded letters and watched the stable yard, and she had kept building around it because building was the only productive response to a fact you could not change. What she felt now, sitting with the confirmation of it, was something closer to clarity. The landscape was not ready. But the contact in the south had told her something important, and the message from 14 months of silence was telling her something important, and she had 3 years of intelligence inside Ironfang's walls that she had never had cause to fully activate. She had been building for survival. She had been building for contingency. She was beginning to understand that she had been building for this. She did not know yet what form it would take. She knew that she would be leaving Ironfang. She knew that the leaving would be managed. She would not simply depart, because a departure handled badly cost you everything you had built, and she had spent 3 years building things she did not intend to cost herself. She was still sitting at her desk when the second summons of the week came. This one was not from Valor. It arrived in the late evening, a formal document on Ironfang seal paper, delivered to her chambers by the court chamberlain himself, a sign of formal procedure rather than personal regard. She read it with the candlelight over her shoulder and then read it again, in the methodical way she reread things that required confirmation. She was requested to present herself before the Alpha King and the assembled senior council at the moon altar the following morning, at the first bell after dawn. For the formal proceeding, the bond severance. She set the document down on her desk and looked at the stable yard, where the torches were going out one by one as the night deepened and the grooms finished their work and went to their own beds, and she let herself sit inside the fullness of what she was about to walk through. The moon altar was the oldest structure in Ironfang, black stone worn smooth by centuries, where the most binding of Wolfpack oaths were made and broken. Bond severance at the moon altar meant nothing could be quietly undone afterward. It was public. It was permanent. It was designed specifically to leave no room for ambiguity. He was making sure she could not come back. She looked at the document a third time, at the formal language about the dissolution proceeding, at the words concerning the return of any Ironfang properties and the conditions of departure from the territory, at the signature Vialor Draven, Alpha King, in his particular forward slanting hand. Then she set it face down on the desk. She spent the remaining hours of the night writing, not coded letters this time. Those had already gone. What she wrote now was different, longer, more specific. 3 documents that had taken her a year to understand she would eventually need to write, and which she had put off writing because writing them would mean she had fully accepted the possibility they were for. She wrote until the stable yard went from dark to gray to pale gold at the horizon. Then she put the documents away in the locked compartment beneath her desk floor, changed her dress, and went to face the moon altar. The hall was full when she arrived. That was the thing she had not quite prepared herself for, the fullness of the hall. She had expected the senior council, the formal witnesses required for the proceeding. What she found was the complete court, assembled in the torch-lit space before the black altar with the air of people who have gathered for a spectacle they are pretending is a solemn occasion. Every face she had learned in 3 years, every lord and lady and general and court functionary who had not looked at her when the announcement was made, they were looking at her now. Valor stood before the altar in full ceremonial armor, dark-plated, with the silver crown of Ironfang on his head. Isolde Marrow stood to his right, not quite in the position that would be official until after the proceeding, but close enough to be unmistakable. Celine walked the length of the hall. She kept her back straight and her pace measured and her face carrying nothing anyone could read, because she had learned in 3 years that composure was a form of power, and she was not going to stand before this court without it. She reached the altar. Valor looked at her, and she looked at him, and in the 2 or 3 seconds before the ritual language began, she had one final clear read of his expression. It was not cold. It was not triumphant. It was something more complicated than either. Something that looked like a man resolving to do a thing he had already decided was necessary by telling himself it was necessary. That, she thought, was the most accurate portrait of Valor Draven she had ever seen. He genuinely believed that strength looked like what he was about to do, that making the largest, boldest, most decisive move was the definition of rule. He did not understand what he was actually doing, could not see the shape of it from inside his own certainty. The court elder began the severance ritual. The words were old, formal, ritualistic. They filled the hall with the sound of a procedure being honored, which was all that proceedings like this were, a way of making irrevocable things feel ordained. The bond broke at the third invocation. It was physical. She had been told it would be physical, had tried to prepare for it, but preparation does not entirely bridge the reality of a thing. The scar that marked the original bond on her wrist went cold, deep cold, bone cold, and for a moment the world contracted to a single point of pain in the center of her chest, sharp and clean, and then gone, leaving behind a particular kind of emptiness that was not absence but the outline of absence. She did not make a sound. The hall did. A collective intake of breath, quiet but present, the sound of a large group of people witnessing something they understand is significant. She kept her eyes on Valor. He kept his eyes on her. "You are released from the bond of Luna to the Ironfang Pack," the elder said. "You are released from the protections and obligations of this court. You are to vacate Ironfang territory before the next dawn." Before dawn. She had until morning. Valor said nothing, not a single word beyond what the ritual required. She had half expected something, some gesture toward the 3 years she had spent in this court, some acknowledgement of the information she had brought him, the letters she had written, the quiet, accurate intelligence she had provided for 36 months without recognition and without asking for it. There was nothing. The proceeding ended. The court waited to see what she would do. She turned from the altar and walked back down the length of the hall, past every face she had memorized, past the lords who had ignored her, and the ladies who had dismissed her, and the generals who had looked through her at meetings. And she walked the full length in silence with her back straight and her face neutral. She reached the door. She went through it. Behind her, she heard the court begin to breathe again, the particular sound of a room that had been holding something and was now releasing it, and she did not stop walking. She went back to the Eastern Tower. She spent 1 hour packing the things that mattered, documents, letters, the locked compartment's contents, certain objects that only she knew the significance of. She left the gowns. She left the silver bond band, setting it on the desk in the particular way that would be visible when the chamberlain came to clear the room. She left Valor's gift of an embossed copy of Ironfang battle history, which he had given her in the first month before he understood she wasn't interesting, and which she had read twice. She had already extracted what was useful from it. At the last hour before dawn, her carriage was ready. It was a plain carriage, no Ironfang crest. She had arranged that 2 weeks ago through a stable contact because she had understood 2 weeks ago that this moment was approaching and she did not intend to leave in anything that belonged to this empire. She climbed in without looking back at the tower. The carriage rolled through the main gate of Ironfang as snow began to fall, light and deliberate, the kind of snow that makes the world very quiet. She watched the gate through the carriage window as the distance grew between it and her, the black iron and the silver steel of the towers she had spent 3 years learning the interior of, and she let herself feel exactly what she felt for exactly as long as the gate was visible. Then the snow thickened and the gate disappeared. She turned to face forward. The carriage was not going where anyone in Ironfang would think to look for her. She had been building the landscape for 3 years. She had just crossed into it. In the inner pocket of her traveling coat, folded small and worn soft with handling, was the message that had arrived through the stableyard courier 12 days ago. They found another one. She had not yet responded to it. She pulled it out now in the dark of the moving carriage with the snow coming down around them, and she read it one more time in the faint light. Then she turned it over and wrote 2 words on the back of it, in her own hand, in the cipher the contact would recognize. Come home. She folded it again. She held it in her closed hand. Outside, the snow was coming down harder. The road south was white and silent and entirely unmarked by anything that knew her name. And in the capital of the Ironfang Empire, the court that had never seen her was just beginning to realize it had never thought to ask what she had been doing with her eyes open for 3 years. It would be too late by the time they did. It was already too late. She just hadn't shown them yet. The road south had no name on any Ironfang map. That was intentional. Celine had chosen it for that reason 18 months ago, when she first began planning routes out of the capital that would not appear in any dispatch or courier log that Valor's intelligence network might later review. It ran along the back edge of the Grey March forest, a logging track mostly, wide enough for a single carriage and deeply rutted from the seasonal timber wagons that used it between spring thaw and the first freeze. In winter, it was empty. In winter, it was exactly what she needed, invisible, functional, and cold enough that any tracker worth his skills would look first at the main roads and only come to the back routes when he had already lost significant time. She did not think Valor would send trackers. She was not certain enough of that to stake her life on it. The carriage rolled through the dark and the snow, and Celine sat with her back against the hard seat and her hands folded in her lap. And she did what she always did when circumstances moved faster than she could fully control. She inventoried. What she had, 3 years of intelligence on Ironfang's military posture, trade routes, lord allegiances, and senior personnel. 2 coded correspondence networks, each compartmentalized enough that compromise of one did not expose the other. The documents from the locked compartment beneath the desk, which represented the most important pieces of a foundation she had been laying without knowing precisely what she was laying it for. The contact in the south, who had found something she needed to understand, and the message in her coat pocket with 2 words written in her own hand on the back of it. What she did not have: time, territory, an army, formal title, or any institutional standing outside the walls of the empire that had just expelled her before dawn in a snowstorm. She had started from less. The first contact point was a town called Veymark, 8 hours south of the Ironfang border, where a merchant house operated a legitimate trading concern on the main square and a considerably less legitimate information exchange out of the building behind it. She had established the Veymark connection 14 months ago through an intermediary she trusted, and she had never visited it in person, which meant her face was not known there, which was an asset. She arrived as the town was coming to life in the gray morning, smoke rising from cook fires, the market square filling with the particular purposeful noise of commerce. She had the carriage stop 3 streets from the merchant house and walked the rest of the way on foot, which was another practice she had developed. Carriages remembered, feet forgot. The merchant house front room smelled of dried herbs and waxed wood. A young man behind the counter looked up when she entered with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to greet customers without registering them. "I'm looking for Grevan," Celine said. "Tell him the Eastern account is here to reconcile." The young man disappeared into the back. She waited, standing, not touching anything, noting the exits. Front door she had come through, a side door half hidden behind a hanging display of dried flower bundles, a window on the eastern wall that faced an alley wide enough to move through quickly. A man appeared from the back who was not what she had expected. She had built a mental image from 14 months of correspondence, careful, precise correspondence, always formal, always measured, of someone older. The man who came through the back doorway was perhaps 40, heavy through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been outdoors most of its life and bore the evidence. He had a scar through his left eyebrow that pulled the brow's outer edge slightly downward, giving him a permanent expression of mild skepticism. He looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man running a rapid calculation. "Wasn't expecting a woman," he said. "Most people aren't," Celine said. "You're Grevan." "I am." "You're the Eastern account." "I am." "You sent a message 12 days ago through the secondary channel." I did. He moved past her and turned the lock on the front door, then gestured toward the side door. Come through. The back room was larger than the front and significantly less decorative. A table, 4 chairs, a heavy iron stove burning low, stacks of ledger books along one wall that Celine suspected were genuine accounting records. Real business as cover for the other business was always more convincing than cover alone. A second man sat at the table, younger, with the careful posture of someone trying to project calm and not quite succeeding. Who is he? Celine said. My partner in the thing I messaged you about, Grevin said. Name's Tor. He found it. She looked at Tor. He had dark eyes that moved to her face and stayed there with the fixed quality of someone who has been waiting a long time to look at something and cannot quite make himself be casual about it. You found another survivor, Celine said. Of the Solaren. Found him 6 weeks ago, Tor said. He was working as a scribe in the Penvar Administrative District. False name, false history. Good enough to survive 8 years, but the kind of false that starts developing cracks when someone who knows what to look for starts looking. He. Older. Mid-50s. He was a secretary to one of the original council members. He had documentation. Celine pulled out a chair and sat down. What kind of documentation? The kind you can't replace, Grevin said, taking the seat across from her. I haven't seen it in full. He showed me enough to know it's real. He's been carrying it for 8 years, moving between cities, staying nowhere long enough to become known. He came to me through a contact who knew I had connections that might... He paused, choosing the word, contextualize it. Where is he now? 3 days' ride from here. Safe house in the Calver district. He's been there for 2 weeks. He's not going to stay patient much longer. Celine looked at the table surface, the grain of the wood, and let herself work through the shape of this. A surviving council secretary with documentation, the word he had used, documentation, in the particular careful way that implied it was not just records but proof, the kind of proof that established lineage, that established the legitimacy of a claim she had not yet made, a claim she had not yet been in a position to make. He knows about me, she said. Not a question. He knows the last Luna of the Iron Fang pack had the Solaren bloodline, because he was there when they put her in Iron Fang for protection 8 years ago. He doesn't know it's you specifically. The contact who connected us was careful about that. Does he know I was just expelled from Iron Fang? A pause. He will when the news travels south, Grevin said. Which it will. This kind of thing moves fast. Celine thought about Veilor in the throne hall this morning, the controlled delivery of a man announcing a fait accompli. The court would talk. The court always talked. Traveling merchants would carry it within days. She had perhaps a week before the shape of her situation became publicly known in the territories south of Ironfang. A week was workable. Barely. I need to meet him, she said. I assumed, Grevin said, I can have a horse ready in an hour. Half an hour, Celine said. And I need someone to move my carriage to a location that is not connected to this building. My man out front can do that. Good. She looked at Tor. The documentation he has, what is the nature of it? Tor leaned forward over the table, and she saw in the movement that he had been holding this information like something fragile, careful about how he set it down. Letters of establishment, he said, written by the original Solaren High Council before the massacre, naming the bloodline heirs, the succession order, the territorial claims under the Solaren Compact. Signed and sealed by 7 council members. He has 6 of the 7 original seals. Celine's hands on the table were still. Letters of establishment with 6 original seals were not merely documents, they were a foundation. The kind of foundation that could support institutional claims in front of neutral arbiters, that could convince uncommitted territories that a lineage was not simply asserted but proven. They were the kind of thing her enemies had spent 8 years assuming were destroyed. He kept them safe for 8 years, she said. Carried them on his person, Tor said. Sewn into the lining of a coat he never let out of his sight. My contact said he sleeps with the coat. 8 years of sleeping in bad rooms and worse situations, and he never let go of them. A man who had kept faith with a destroyed institution for 8 years on the off chance someone survived to use what he was carrying. She felt something shift in her chest that was not sentiment, but was in the same general territory as it. Half an hour, she said to Grevin. Have the horse ready. The ride to Calver took until late afternoon, through terrain that flattened gradually from the forest margins into the agricultural plains that made up the Southern Territory's economic base. Celine rode without speaking to the man Grieven had sent with her as guide, a spare figure named Setch who communicated primarily in directional gestures and seemed to have no opinion about her existence, which she appreciated. She used the hours to think, the horse's movement a rhythm under her that let her mind run without the interruptions of social management. She had a week, approximately, before her expulsion from Ironfang was common southern knowledge. She had a man 3 days ago from Weimar who had documentation that could establish a legal basis for a claim she had not yet made. She had 2 correspondence networks and 3 years of intelligence about Ironfang that would have significant value to specific parties. And she had been, for 3 years, building something whose shape had been emerging slowly enough that she had not yet been forced to name it. She named it now, riding through the flat gray afternoon toward a scribe in a safe house in Calver who had kept faith for 8 years. She was going to build a domain, not reclaim one. The Solarian territories were gone, scattered, their physical remnants absorbed into neighboring kingdoms over 8 years of strategic consolidation by the people who had engineered the massacre. You could not reclaim what had been that thoroughly dismantled, but the compact still existed in law. The letters of establishment, if authentic, created a legal basis under the old interkingdom accords that predated every current border arrangement. Those accords had never been formally dissolved because dissolving them would have required acknowledgement that the Solarian line still had claimants, which the people who wanted it dead had spent 8 years ensuring never happened. They had not anticipated a council secretary who slept with a coat. They had not anticipated her. She arrived at the Calver safe house as the last light was going out of the sky, a nondescript building behind a cooperage that smelled of wood shavings and old barrel stave. Setch knocked in a particular sequence, and after a moment the door opened from inside. The man who had kept faith for 8 years was small, gray-haired, with the compressed posture of someone who had spent a long time trying to take up less space in the world. He looked at Celine in the doorway with the eyes of a man running a recognition he had prepared himself for and was still not prepared for. His name was Aldrich Voss. He had been secretary to the Solarian High Council's trade minister for 11 years before the massacre. He had been in the Southern Territories on a courier assignment when the massacre happened, which was why he was alive, and he had understood within hours of hearing the news that being alive and being known to be alive were 2 entirely different situations. He had chosen to be unknown for 8 years. He looked at Celine and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. "They said you were playing," he said finally. "They said a lot of things," Celine said. "I heard what happened at Ironfang this morning." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The room was small and meticulously ordered in the way of someone who has learned that control over immediate surroundings is a form of psychological survival. A single lamp, a table, a cot with a gray wool blanket folded at military precision, a coat hanging on a hook by the door that she clocked immediately. Heavy, unremarkable, the lining slightly thicker than it needed to be. "You heard this morning," Celine said. "The Ironfang merchant courier stops in Calver. The driver talks." Aldrich sat at the table and folded his hands over each other with the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to long waits. "He said the king severed his bond at the moon altar and expelled the Luna before dawn. He said she walked out without a word." "That's accurate." "He also said the Alpha King looked like he'd made a decision and regretted it in the same breath." Celine sat in the chair across from him. "Did he?" "Driver said the court was very quiet after you left. The kind of quiet that means something is wrong, and no one wants to be the first to say it." She filed that away. Not with satisfaction, she was too tired for satisfaction, but with the precise notation of someone cataloging relevant information. "You have the letters," she said. "I have them." He didn't move toward the coat. He stayed with his hands folded and his eyes on her face, doing something more than looking. "I've been carrying them for 8 years on the possibility that someone with the blood and the capability would survive long enough to use them. I need to know which of those 2 things I'm actually sitting across from." "You want to know if I'm capable?" "I watched the old council," Aldrich said. "I watched what happened when they had the right blood and not the right people. We had the lineage. We had the legal compacts. We had 3 kingdoms worth of territory and 30 years of accumulated trade wealth. And in one night, we had nothing, because the people at the top had mistaken institutional comfort for institutional strength." He looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who had been lied to by impressive people and learned from it. "You spent 3 years in Ironfang's court as a discarded Luna. Now you're sitting in a cooperage safe house 2 days after being expelled at dawn. Tell me why I should give you what I've been carrying." The question did not offend her. She understood exactly what it was. The final gate between 8 years of sustained faith and the act of trusting that faith to the right hands. He had not kept those documents for sentiment. He had kept them for use, and using them wrong would be worse than the 8 years of carrying them alone. "Because I built 2 intelligence networks inside the court that expelled me," she said, "and I haven't used either of them against Iron Fang yet, which means I exercise judgment about when and what to deploy rather than reaching for resources out of impulse." She held his gaze. "Because I read the Ashvale arbitration records and understood the Marrow Port litigation before Valor's intelligence service did, and I used that information to buy time rather than to gain credit. Because the 3 years I spent in Iron Fang, I spent learning the interior of an empire, not waiting to be seen. And because you've been carrying those documents for 8 years and you're still alive, which means you understand the difference between a good foundation and a finished house, and what I'm proposing to build requires that distinction." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, went to the coat on the hook, and reached into the lining. The letters were exactly as Tor had described. Formal documents on the heavy pressed paper that the Solaran Council had used for binding instruments. The seals intact on 6 of the 7 signatures. The ink faded at the edges from years against a coat lining, but the text legible. The chain of provenance, notarized in the old Inner Kingdom style. She read them. Not quickly. She read the way she always read things that mattered, which was completely, meaning she registered not just the content, but the language choices and the legal formulations and the specific wording of the territorial claims. The Solaran Compact, as articulated in the Letters of Establishment, did not specify a geography. It specified a standard. Any territory operating under the Compact's governance principles, formally acknowledged by 3 or more independent kingdoms, constituted a Solaran domain. The geography was not required to be the original territory. A new domain was legally possible under the Compact. A new domain required acknowledgement by 3 independent kingdoms. She did not have 3 kingdoms yet. She was beginning to see how she might get them. "These are real," she said. "I know they're real," Aldrich said. "I was in the room when they were signed." She set them on the table with the care of someone handling something that has survived longer than it should have and deserves to survive longer still. "I need to tell you something about the second name on the establishment list," she said. Aldrich stilled. "The second signatory," she continued. "Lord Vance Solaran, 3rd seat of the High Council. His son survived the massacre." Aldrich's expression did not change dramatically. It compressed, the way expressions do when they are trying to contain something too large to show in public. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I found him 4 years ago, through channels I built for a different purpose. He's been in the Western Territories under a different name for 8 years. He's 32 now. He works as a land surveyor, which tells me his father's instincts survived the bloodline. Lord Vance always said you understood power by understanding terrain." She paused. "I haven't contacted him directly. I needed to know what I was building before I brought him into it." "You've known for 4 years." "I've known for 4 years." Aldrich sat back down. He put his folded hands back on the table and looked at the letters of establishment between them, and was quiet for a moment that was not empty. "You've been building the house," he said. "I've been building the foundation," Celine said. "The house requires more than I have right now." "What do you need?" "A location. Somewhere south of the Iron Fang border and north of the Silvercrest territories, in the contested zone where no single kingdom holds clear jurisdiction. A location with defensive geography, access to trade routes, and existing infrastructure that can be rebuilt rather than constructed from nothing." Aldrich looked at her steadily. "I know a location. I assumed you might. It belonged to the original Solaran Administrative Network, a post station originally in the Vethran Valley. It's been empty for 6 years. The local territory holders consider it a liability and have been trying to sell it without success because the access roads require maintenance that no one has funded." He paused. "It has a defensible perimeter and sits at the intersection of 3 trade road junctions." 3 trade road junctions. Control of the right road junctions was worth more than most armies. "How do you know it's still empty?" Celine said. "Because I walked past it 14 months ago," Aldrich said. "I've been maintaining awareness of it since I understood what it might be for." He looked at her. "I've been waiting for someone to come for it." She felt the specific texture of that. 8 years of a man maintaining careful awareness of an empty building in a valley, on the possibility that someone would eventually arrive who understood why it mattered. "I'll need you," she said. "Not just the documents, you specifically." "I know," Aldrich said. "That's why I'm still here." The planning conversation lasted until after midnight. She didn't notice the hours passing, which was a condition she recognized. The specific absorption of a problem that exactly fit her capacity, the state in which the gap between the size of the thing and her resources for addressing it was precisely challenging enough to generate focus rather than paralysis. They worked through what the letters established legally, what was still needed for the first formal acknowledgement request, what the Vethrin location could and could not provide, and who in the existing Southern Territory network could be approached without alerting the intelligence operations she knew Iron Fang maintained south of its border. There were more such operations than Valor understood. She had mapped them during her second year in the court, cross-referencing the courier schedules with the Lord Advisor's private expense accounts, and she had concluded that his intelligence south of the border was wider than he knew, but considerably less reliable than he believed, because the people running it were optimizing for appearing productive rather than being accurate. This was a common failure of fear-based structures. She had watched it operate for 3 years. When the people below you fear the consequences of bad news more than they value accuracy, you receive a version of the world that has been curated to protect the people reporting it. Valor's Southern intelligence told him what his intelligence operatives believed he wanted to hear, which meant he had a systematically distorted picture of the territory south of his border. She had a more accurate one. Around the second hour past midnight, Aldrich made tea, real tea, not the grain water substitute that was common in the cheaper southern towns, and they sat with it and were quiet for a few minutes in the way of people who have been working hard at something serious and need the pause. "You're different than I expected," Aldrich said. "What did you expect?" "Someone angrier." He looked at his tea. "After what happened, the court, the altar, I expected someone who had that in their face." "I am angry," Celine said. "I'm not going to spend it on expression." Aldrich nodded, slow and considered. "That's what the old council never understood about the people who destroyed them. The Solarian leadership was principled. They believed in the visible performance of their values. They thought being seen to be above the crude work of institutional self-protection was a virtue." He set down his cup. "The people who killed them were not above it." "I know," Celine said. "I grew up in the remnants of that lesson." She had. She had grown up understanding exactly what the gap between performed virtue and structural strength had cost. She was not going to make the same mistake, which did not mean she was going to abandon principle. It meant she was going to understand the difference between principle and naivety, and build the former without confusing it for the latter. She had spent 3 years in Valor's court watching a man who understood structural strength and had no patience for anything that didn't look like immediate dominance, and she had watched the specific blind spots that combination produced. She did not intend to produce the same ones. She left Calver before dawn, which was becoming a pattern she associated with beginnings. Aldrich would follow in 3 days, after he'd arranged for the Vethrin location to be assessed by a contact who knew the valley. Thetch, who remained economical with words, rode with her back toward the north, where she had other stops to make before she could move south toward anything resembling a foundation. The first stop was the town of Renner's Cross, where a woman named Deva Helm ran a courier network that had no official connection to any noble house, which was exactly why it worked as well as it did. Celine had used Deva's network for outbound letters during the Iron Fang years, always through cutouts, never establishing direct contact. The relationship was professional and entirely transactional, which made it more reliable than relationships built on personal trust. Deva Helm was a compact, weathered woman in her mid-40s who received Celine in the back of her courier station with the brisk efficiency of someone whose time was composed of small pieces that she tracked carefully. "Eastern account," Deva said, not looking up from the dispatch she was annotating. "I heard you were moving." "Word travels. It travels through my network specifically, which is how I heard by midday. What do you need?" "I need the primary southern route system redirected," Celine said. "Everything that currently goes through the Iron Fang border relay should route through Veymark instead, starting immediately." Deva looked up then. "The Iron Fang relay pays well. I'll pay better, and I need a coverage assessment for the Vethrin Valley region, specifically whether your network has existing stops in the valley or whether new ones would need to be established." Deva set down her pen. She had the kind of face that processed information visibly, not emotionally, but with the legible movements of someone who thinks efficiently and doesn't bother concealing the mechanism. Vethran Valley, she said. You know it. I know it's been an operational dead zone for 6 years because the old Solarian post station anchored the Valley Relay, and when it closed, the whole network collapsed. I've had no coverage in Vethran for 6 years, which means I've been routing 3 trade road junctions through the long way round, which adds 2 days to anything moving between the Central Plains and the coast. She paused. If the Vethran post were to reopen, I would have significant operational interest in establishing stops there. That's the conversation we're going to have, Celine said. They had it. It took 2 hours and produced an agreement that was verbal and specific, the kind of agreement that people who operate in unofficial networks preferred because written contracts were evidence, and evidence was liability. Deva would establish Vethran Valley coverage contingent on the post station becoming operational. In exchange, Celine's correspondence network would receive priority routing and guaranteed security on the primary southern lanes. It was not an army. It was a nervous system. A domain without a functioning information network was a territory. A territory with one was something else. She slept that night in a room above Deva's courier station, the first real sleep she had managed since before the summons arrived at her chambers. She woke before dawn because she had trained herself to do that and lay in the dark for a moment, cataloging. The anger was still there. She had told Aldrich the truth. She was angry, and she was not going to spend it on expression. Anger spent as expression was temporary and cost you information, because people recalibrated their behavior around visible anger in ways that made them less legible. Anger held as fuel was different. It was cleaner and more precise, and it lasted longer. She thought about Valor standing at the moon altar in his ceremonial armor with Isolde Marrow positioned to his right, like an object being placed in its intended location. And she thought about the 3 years she had spent building inside his walls, and she let the anger do its work, which was not to make her bitter, but to make her clear. She was clear. She was clearer than she had been in 3 years, because for 3 years the clarity had been partially occluded by the effort of maintaining the performance of smallness, and now she did not have to perform smallness anymore. She was expelled. She was outside the walls. She was no longer required to manage how visible she was. She could be exactly as large as she actually was. She got up before the sun rose and went downstairs to write letters. The letters that went out from Renner's Cross that morning were the most direct correspondence she had produced in 3 years. No ciphers except where strictly necessary. No careful indirection. She was writing to people she had been carefully oblique with for 36 months, and she was no longer oblique. The letter to the land surveyor in the Western Territories was the most direct of all. It said, I know who you are. I know who your father was. I have the letters of establishment. I am building something that requires what you carry in your bloodline. Come to Veymark in 10 days if you want to be part of it. She sealed it and gave it to Dava's morning courier without allowing herself to reconsider the directness. Then she went back out into the cold morning and the road. The news from Iron Fang caught up with her at the 3rd stop, not through her networks, through the ordinary movement of it, the way significant events ripple outward from their origin point through traders and travelers, and the organic human machinery of gossip and information transfer. She was sitting in a roadside inn at the edge of the Grey March Forest's southern margin, eating something that was technically stew, when the 2 merchants at the next table began discussing it with the particular relish of people who have come into possession of dramatic information. The merchants had it roughly right, which told her the version that was spreading was not being controlled by Iron Fang's information apparatus. A controlled version would be softer on the details of the public ceremony, would smooth the edges of how it had happened. This version had the moon altar and the before-dawn exile and the court's silence when she walked out, which meant it was traveling organically, person to person, preserving the details that people found most striking. What people found most striking, based on the 2 merchants' conversation, was not the rejection. Rejections happened. Kings made political marriages and severed inconvenient bonds, and the court world processed these events as the administrative decisions they were. What people found striking was the silence. The Luna who walked the length of the hall without speaking. The court that watched without speaking. The particular quality of a public humiliation that had felt apparently to those who witnessed it, not like dominance but like something else that they did not have a word for yet. She listened without appearing to listen and ate her stew and thought about that. She had not planned the silence as a strategy. She had simply not had anything to say to a room full of people who had already made their decision, and she had not been willing to perform grief for an audience that would have interpreted it as confirmation of the weakness they had always assumed. But the silence had become something. It had carried. She understood why. Silence in a moment designed for humiliation does not read as acceptance. It reads as refusal. A particular, absolute kind of refusal that the person performing the humiliation cannot counter because there is nothing to push against. Vailor had designed the moon altar proceeding to be final. He had designed it to have the quality of a thing completely resolved. What it apparently felt like from inside the room was something that had not yet finished unfolding. She finished her stew and paid and went back out to the road, and she carried that knowledge with her, adding it to the inventory. She was 3 days into her new life, and the shape of it was becoming legible. Not complete. Far from complete. There were 100 things still unresolved, and 20 she could not yet even name as problems because she didn't have enough information yet. But the shape was there. She could see it. It was the 4th day out from Ironfang, moving steadily south through the graying afternoon with Setch's horse a length ahead of hers, when the rider came up hard from behind. Not Ironfang. She read that immediately from the horse, which was a plains breed, not the northern mountain stock that Ironfang's military used. And not a threat, because a threat approaching from behind on an empty road would not come at a canter in plain sight. The rider pulled up alongside her, breathing hard from the pace, with the specific expression of someone who has ridden fast to deliver something urgent and is still organizing how to say it. "You're the Eastern Account," the rider said. "Who's asking?" Celine said. "I'm asking from Grevin. He said find you on the south road and only say this to your face." The rider gathered breath. Ironfang moved faster than expected. Alpha King Draven announced a full military parade of the Northern Campaign victories. The announcement is covering something. Grevin's contacts inside Ironfang say Isolde Marrow was in closed session with the senior generals within 6 hours of the moon altar proceeding. She brought her own advisors. They'd been in the war room since yesterday morning. Celine looked at the road ahead. She had expected Isolde to move quickly. She had not expected within 6 hours. "What else?" she said. "Grevin says the word from inside is that Ironfang's already repositioning its Southern intelligence assets. Someone told them the secondary channel network runs through Veymark." The secondary channel. Her second network. Someone had told them. That network had 6 people in it, all of whom she had built relationships with over years, all of whom she had been careful about, and one of them had, within hours of the moon altar, given up the Veymark connection. She worked through the 6 names in her head, fast and cold, the way you run a problem when you do not have the luxury of being careful about how you feel about the answer. And she arrived at the same name twice. The only one who had both direct knowledge of the Veymark connection and a reason, as of yesterday morning, to offer information to Ironfang's intelligence apparatus. The only one she had trusted with both the network structure and the Veymark anchor point. She had trusted him because she had assessed him as loyal. She had been wrong, which meant her assessment was wrong, which meant the error was hers. She sat with that for exactly as long as the road required before the next decision demanded her attention, and then she set it aside. "Tell Grevin to pull everything through the secondary channel immediately," she said. "Nothing moves on it from this point. He'll know what to do with the assets. He has the protocol." "He said you'd say that," the writer said. "He also said to tell you, the name on the Eastern account list that starts with K. Grevin said you'd know." K, she knew. She looked at the gray afternoon sky above the south road and felt the specific cold of an understanding arriving that you had partly hoped would not arrive. "Tell Grevin I received the message," she said. "Tell him to handle it quietly and not leave evidence that would reach Ironfang's people before we're ready." The rider nodded and turned his horse and went back the way he had come at the same hard canter. Celine looked at the road ahead. Ironfang had her secondary channel location. It did not have what she had. It did not have Aldrich and the letters, and the Vethrin Valley, and the conversation with Dava Helm, and the courier going west with a letter to a land surveyor. It did not have the shape of what she was building, because the shape was not yet visible to anyone outside the specific sequence of conversations she had just had. But it was moving. It had been moving since before dawn yesterday, and it was moving faster than she had planned for. She was now in a situation she recognized from the intelligence report she had read in Iron Fang's administrative wing. The situation of a new actor in a contested space who had lost the advantage of being unknown and had not yet established the advantage of being established. That gap between those two things was where most people failed. She was not going to fail in it. She looked at Setch, who had heard none of the conversation and was waiting with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. "Change of route," she said. "We're not stopping again until Veymark." "That's a hard ride," Setch said. "I know," Celine said. "Let's go." She put her heels to the horse and moved. Behind her, somewhere north on the same road, Iron Fang's intelligence apparatus was beginning to understand that the woman who had walked out of the moon altar without speaking was not walking away. She was walking towards something, and by the time they understood what, it was going to be too late to position themselves ahead of it. Or so she told herself, riding hard into the gray south, with the inventory still running in the back of her mind and the anger burning clean and useful in her chest, and the particular absolute certainty of a person who has stopped performing smallness and is not going to start again. But there was something she did not yet know, something she could not have known, because it had happened in the 6 hours after the moon altar proceeding, while she was already on the South Road. Valor's closed war room session with Isolde Marrow's advisors had produced one outcome she had not accounted for. A document, formal and sealed, issued under Iron Fang's military authority, declaring Celine Veyra a person of compromised alliance, which was the specific legal classification under Iron Fang's military compact that authorized partner kingdoms to detain, and in certain circumstances extradite, a named individual. The document had gone to 17 kingdoms. 4 of them, including 2 in the Southern Territories, had already acknowledged receipt. She was not simply expelled. She was now officially a target, and the road she was riding to Veymark was about to intersect with an Iron Fang allied border checkpoint that had not existed yesterday morning. She saw the checkpoint before she reached it. That was the only thing that saved her. Not skill, not preparation, not the careful intelligence she had spent 3 years building. Pure sight. The road curved through a stand of bare-branched elms 200 yards ahead, and through the gaps in the trunks she caught the particular glint of metal that did not belong to a logging operation or a merchant convoy. It had the organized quality of military positioning, the way a group of armed men arranged at a road point always looked slightly different from any other kind of human gathering, even at distance, even in failing light. She pulled her horse to a stop. Setch stopped beside her without being told, which told her he had seen it too. They sat for a moment in the silence of the gray afternoon, the horses breathing steam into the cold air, the elms between them and whatever was waiting at the road. "How many?" she said quietly. Setch looked for longer than she had. He was better at distance assessment than she was. It was the thing he was actually useful for, beyond direction and discretion. 6 visible, he said. Probably 2 more in the trees east side. Standard checkpoint formation. He paused. Not Iron Fang colors. No. The colors were Renwater, one of the 2 southern kingdoms that had acknowledged receipt of Iron Fang's military compact document. She had not known Renwater would move this fast. She had underestimated the reach of the declaration and the speed of its implementation, which was an intelligence failure, and she catalogued it with the precise cold neutrality she applied to all her own mistakes, because understanding them accurately was the only way to not repeat them. "Can we go back?" she said. "Back to the last fork is 2 miles. They could have a second position at the fork." "Do they?" "I don't know," Setch said. He was not a man who invented certainty he didn't have, which was why she had chosen him. She looked at the checkpoint through the elms. She looked at the road that went back. She looked at the terrain on either side. The Grey March forest margin to the west, dense and dark and difficult in winter, and the open agricultural fields to the east, flat and visible for a half-mile in every direction. She thought about what she was carrying. Not the documents. Those were in Aldrich's hands. But the knowledge. The network maps. The names of every contact she had built in 3 years. Alive in her head in the form that could not be taken from the locked compartment and searched. If Renwater held her for Iron Fang, the people who received her would understand that what she knew was worth more than any paper she might be carrying. And Iron Fang's interrogation methods were not gentle. She thought about Aldrich walking toward Veymark in 3 days with the letters of establishment in his coat lining. She thought about the courier going west with a letter to a land surveyor who did not yet know he had been found. She thought about the name that started with K and what Greven was doing about it, and the secondary network that was compromised, and the 17 kingdoms that had received the military compact document. She made her decision in the time it took the horses to exhale once. "West," she said, "into the forest." Setch looked at the forest margin. He did not argue, which meant he had already run the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion. He simply turned his horse and moved, and she followed, and they rode off the road into the tree line before the checkpoint could have had a clear sight line to the road behind the elm curve. The Grey March forest in winter was a different environment than the road. The ground was uneven and root-crossed, the trees close enough in places to require single-file movement, the light already failing faster in the tree shadow than it was in the open. It was cold in a different way than cold in the open. Wetter, closer, the kind of cold that worked its way into joints. She had never been in the Grey March forest. She had maps of it in her head from the administrative report she had read in Iron Fang's planning wing, but maps were abstractions, and forest floors were real, and the difference between them became apparent within the first 20 minutes of riding. Setch navigated without consulting her, which she permitted. This was his element more than hers. She rode behind him and let her mind work the problem she had not yet fully addressed. The secondary network was compromised. The name that started with K was Karev, a merchant contact in the Iron Fang capital, whom she had built the relationship with over 2 years, carefully and incrementally, in the way you build relationships with people who have good access and moderate courage. She had never asked him for more than information. She had always paid him fairly. She had believed, based on 30 months of consistent behavior, that he was reliable. The rider from Greven had given her the signal that meant Karev was the one who had talked. She ran back through what Karev knew. He knew the Veymark anchor. He knew the secondary channel routing. He did not know Aldrich. He did not know the letters of establishment. He did not know Vethrin. He did not know the Western Surveyor. He knew about Greven, which meant Greven was now exposed. She needed to warn Greven before Iron Fang's people reached Veymark. She had no way to send a message through the secondary channel because the secondary channel was compromised. She had no way to send a message through the primary channel because she was currently riding through a winter forest with no courier access. She had, she realized, a significant problem. The forest went dark fast. Setch found a depression between two root masses that offered some shelter from wind and indicated they should stop, which she agreed with. Riding through unfamiliar forest in the dark was how horses broke legs, and a horse with a broken leg was a situation that cascaded into worse situations with considerable speed. They stopped. They could not make a fire because fire was visible. They ate what was in their travel bags, which was hard bread and something salted that had been better at some earlier point in its existence. And they sat in the cold dark and listened to the forest settle around them. "You have friends south of here," Setch said. It was the most words he had produced voluntarily in 2 days. "I have contacts," she said. "There's a difference." "How far?" "The nearest one who doesn't know the compromised channel is a day south of Veymark, assuming we get through the checkpoint problem." "There's a logging track that comes out south of the checkpoint position," Setch said. "I used it 3 years ago. It adds 4 hours. She looked at him in the dark. "You know this forest," she said. "I know the logging tracks. I moved timber through here before I worked for Greven." She filed this away. The information that Setch had worked for Greven before becoming a guide, which she had not known, and which recontextualized several things about why Greven had recommended him specifically. "The track comes out where?" she said. "South of the checkpoint, quarter-mile past it. Then it's open road again." "Then that's where we go in the morning," she said. She did not sleep well. She slept in the way of someone who is tired enough that the body insists on it, but whose mind does not fully release, so that she moved through something that was rest but not restoration, and woke before the forest began to gray with a stiff back and the particular awareness of someone who has been cataloging problems through the hours of not quite sleep and is now ready to address them. She addressed the most pressing one first. She needed to reach Greven before Iron Fang reached Veymark. The secondary channel was gone. The primary channel was Deva Helm's courier network in Renner's Cross, which she had already redirected yesterday. But Deva's network reached Veymark. Deva had said it explicitly, because Veymark was on the primary route system. If she could reach a primary channel relay point before Iron Fang's people reached Veymark, she could get a warning through. She calculated. Iron Fang's intelligence people working from Karev's information would need to physically move to Veymark and locate Grevin's operation. That was not instant. It required verification, travel, the internal institutional process of deploying assets. Iron Fang was efficient, but efficiency had friction. She had possibly 12 hours, possibly less. The logging track Setch described was 4 additional hours. She would come out south of the checkpoint in the morning, and the nearest primary channel relay point she knew was a village called Ooster, 2 hours south of the checkpoint exit. She could reach Ooster by midday if she rode hard. She could still get the warning through, maybe. She woke Setch, and they moved before the forest was fully light, picking through the root-crossed ground in the gray pre-dawn, the horses slow and careful. It took longer than she wanted, and not as long as she feared, and by the time the light was full, they were on the logging track, which was rough but navigable, and moving at a pace that did not feel like enough, but was what the terrain allowed. She thought about Karev. She thought about him with the specific quality of attention she gave to her own failures, which was thorough and unsentimental. She had built him as a contact over 2 years. She had assessed his motivations accurately. He wanted money and he wanted to stay out of trouble. And she had given him money and she had been careful not to make him visible. The assessment had been correct. What she had failed to account for was the thing that money and caution couldn't hold against: genuine fear. Karev had not sold her for more money. Karev had been reached by people who represented a threat he could not calculate his way past, and he had given them what he had in exchange for the assurance that the threat would not become something worse. This was the difference between a reliable asset and a resilient one. Reliability was situational. It held until the situation changed past a threshold. Resilience was different and rarer and required a different kind of building. She had built for reliability. She had not built for the situation changing this fast. She was building for resilience now, in the only way available to her, which was by understanding exactly what the failure had cost and what it had not. They came out of the forest onto the open road at mid-morning, the checkpoint behind them and invisible around the elm curve, and she put her heels to the horse and did not slow down. Ooster was a village built around a river crossing, the kind of settlement that existed because of the bridge rather than in spite of the terrain, and it had the rough functional character of a place whose entire economy was predicated on being in between 2 other places. The primary channel relay point was a small depot run by a man named Fell, who was not officially connected to Dava Helm's network, but who maintained a flag system that the network used. She reached it 2 hours after coming out of the forest, her horse breathing hard and her back beyond stiff now into something that was going to make tomorrow difficult. She dismounted at the depot and found Fell inside, a small man with a precisely trimmed beard who looked up from his accounts with the neutrality of a person who handled unusual situations often enough to have stopped reacting to them. "Primary channel," she said. "Urgent relay to Veymark. The message is, the secondary location is burned. Move now. East protocol." Fell looked at her. "Who am I sending it from?" he said. "Eastern account." "He'll know." "Cost you double for the urgent flag." "Bill the Veymark account," she said. "Fell, please move quickly." Something in her voice reached him. Not desperation, she was too controlled for desperation, but the specific quality of urgency that cannot be entirely suppressed when the clock is running. And he nodded and went to the relay window. She stood in the depot and breathed. She had done what she could do. Whether Graven received it in time depended on how fast Iron Fang moved and how fast Dava's relay ran, and 20 other variables she could not control from a river-crossing depot in Ooster. This was the part of it she had always found hardest, the moment after the action, when the outcome was in other hands and waiting was the only option. She bought bread at the market stall near the bridge and ate it standing up, watching the river run cold and fast under the crossing, and she let herself feel the full weight of the situation she was in. She was expelled, officially classified as a target, moving through hostile-aligned territory with a compromised network and a checkpoint she had barely avoided. The people she most needed to protect, Aldrich, the surveyor she had sent for, Greven, were all exposed to varying degrees, and her capacity to protect them had been significantly degraded in less than 24 hours. This was the cost of moving before the Foundation was complete. She had told herself she had time. She had been wrong about the time. She thought about Valor in the closed war room session with Isolde Mero's advisors, and she thought about what that session had produced, and she thought about the speed of it. 6 hours from the moon altar to the military compact document, 6 hours from the moment she walked down the length of the hall to the moment she was officially a target. That speed was not Valor. Valor was capable and cold-minded, but his instincts ran toward the monumental, the large gesture, the permanent statement. 6 hours to a 17-kingdom document was operational speed, the kind that came from someone who had prepared the mechanism in advance and was waiting for the trigger. Isolde Marrow had prepared the mechanism. Isolde had been inside Iron Fang's court for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks she had been building something that Selene had assessed as social positioning. Court insertion. The performance of making herself central before the formal announcement. She had been doing more than that. She had been setting up the apparatus to move the moment Selene was removed, because Isolde Marrow had understood, with the competence of a genuine military strategist, that Selene was the variable that could not be left loose. Selene had underestimated her. She set that fact down carefully in the place she kept the things she had gotten wrong, and she looked at it without flinching. She had read Isolde accurately in terms of motivation and general capability. She had failed to read the depth of her preparation. She had assumed Isolde was reactive, responding to the situation as it developed, when Isolde had in fact been planning this specific outcome for longer than the 3 weeks in Iron Fang's court would suggest. Which meant Isolde's presence in Iron Fang was not opportunistic. Which meant the initial approach, the arrival at the victory celebration, the proposal, the specific timing of it all, was not coincidence intersecting with Valor's ambitions. It was a planned sequence. Selene stood at the river crossing in Uster and felt the shape of something larger than she had previously understood settle into place in her thinking. Isolde Marrow had not arrived at Iron Fang to offer an alliance. She had arrived to acquire it, specifically, with preparation that predated the Northern Campaign victory, which meant she had intelligence on Iron Fang that was older than her apparent relationship with Valor suggested, which meant someone had been feeding her information about Iron Fang's internal situation for longer than 3 weeks. Someone inside Iron Fang's court. Selene thought about Karev, who had given up the secondary channel. Karev, who had worked as a merchant contact inside the capital. Karev, whose information access was limited to what Selene had used him for, but whose existence as a paid intelligence asset was something that any competent opposing operator would find interesting. Karev had not been her asset exclusively. The possibility arranged itself in her mind with the cold clarity of a thing she did not want to be true and was going to be true regardless. She had been running Karev through a layer of cutouts, carefully, because she was careful about exposure. But cutouts were not invisible. They were a reduction of visibility, not an elimination of it. And if Isolde's people had been mapping Iron Fang's intelligence ecosystem for longer than 3 weeks, they would have been looking for exactly the kind of secondary network that Selene had been building. They might have found Karev before she did. They might have found Karev before she did, and let the relationship develop, because a secondary network you know about is more useful than one you have to search for. You watch it, you let it run, and then, at the moment that best serves your purposes, you pull it. She bought a second piece of bread because she was hungry and her hands needed something to do, and she stood at the river crossing and built this possibility to its logical end. If Isolde's people had been watching Karev, they had been watching the secondary channel. They had known the Vaymark anchor for as long as the secondary channel had been using it, which was 14 months. 14 months of knowing where Greven's operation was anchored. 14 months of choosing not to move on it. Because moving on it would tell Selene the network was compromised, and they wanted Selene's network intact and producing information until the moment came to use the compromise. The moment had been the moon altar. The moment had been the instant she left Iron Fang, because the instant she left was the instant her network became a liability to Isolde rather than an asset. She was no longer inside the walls producing useful information, so the network that had been feeding Isolde could be used to destroy her instead. She had not been merely expelled. She had been tracked for 14 months. The bread was in her hand and she was not eating it. She set it down on the bridge railing and looked at the river. She had built what she had believed was a protected secondary network, and someone had been reading its output for over a year, and she had not known. That was a different order of failure than Karev's reliability. That was a failure of her fundamental operational assumption that she was building unseen. She had not been unseen. She had been watched, deliberately, by someone patient enough to let her keep building while they read what she was building. Isolde Marrow was more capable than Selene had revised her assessment to reflect. She needed to revise it again. She picked up the bread, ate it, and walked back to where Setch was watering the horses. I need to change the destination, she said. Setch looked up from the horses. We're not going to Veymark, she said. We're going to Aldrich. That's east, Setch said. I know. How long? From here, with the horses in this condition, 2 days hard or 3 days at a pace that doesn't destroy them. She looked at the horses. They were not in good condition. She had been pushing them since yesterday morning, and the forest floor had been hard on their legs, and an animal ridden to break down in hostile territory was worse than no animal. 3 days, she said. But we find a different route. Why different? Because the route we planned is in someone else's map now, she said. Setch accepted this with the equanimity he applied to most things, which she was beginning to understand was not in curiosity, but the wisdom of a man who had learned that the full picture usually arrived eventually and premature questions wasted energy. They moved east. The first day was the hardest because east meant skirting the edge of Renwater-aligned territory, which meant staying off the main roads and using the field tracks that ran between agricultural holdings, which were badly maintained in late autumn and worse in winter. The horses had to pick carefully. The pace was slower than 3 days would comfortably allow. She used the time to think. The message she had sent from Ooster, Move Now, East Protocol, would reach Greven through the primary channel relay if the relay ran at the pace Deva had described. East Protocol meant relocate to the second site, destroy primary records, cease all secondary channel activity. Greven would know what to do. Whether he had time to do it was the question she could not answer from a field track in the Southern Territories. She thought about what Iron Fang knew. They knew the Veymark anchor. They had the military compact document in 17 kingdoms. They had Karev's information about the channel structure. They did not, she was reasonably confident, know about Aldrich, because Aldrich had been her primary network's most protected asset, held completely separate from the secondary channel, known to fewer people than any other element of what she had built. But reasonably confident was not certain. She had been reasonably confident about the secondary channel. The thing about being systematically watched was that you could not reconstruct what was known and unknown from the inside. You had to assume that the watcher was competent, and a competent watcher might know more than the known breach revealed. Karev was the visible break. There might be others she had not yet found. She rode through the field tracks and the cold gray days, and she rebuilt her understanding of her situation from the assumption that Isolde's people were more capable than the worst case she had previously planned for. The worst case she had planned for was a targeted but limited intelligence compromise. The new worst case was a systematic surveillance operation that had been running for over a year and might have penetrated further than the secondary channel. In the new worst case, what was still safe? Aldrich, possibly, because he had been completely siloed from the secondary channel, and because his contact with her had been established through Gravan's primary channel before the 14 months of secondary surveillance began. The letters of establishment, because they existed only in Aldrich's coat lining and no document about them had ever moved through the secondary channel. The Vethrin location, because she had learned it from Aldrich directly and had not communicated it through any channel. The surveyor in the west, because the letter she had sent to him yesterday was the first direct contact she had ever initiated with him, through the primary channel, and even if Isolde's people had penetrated the primary channel, which was a worse case than the worst case, they would have received a letter addressed to a false name at a courier drop, which was not enough to identify him. These were the things that might still be intact. She held them as what remained of the foundation and built from there, moving east through the field tracks with Setch ahead of her, and the cold settling deeper each evening. On the second day they stopped at a farmhouse, whose owners fed them in exchange for coin without asking questions, which was the kind of hospitality that existed at the economic margin and was not ideological but entirely transactional, and she sat at the farmhouse table in the warmth of a cook fire and listened to the farmer's wife describe the news that had come through the territory in the past 2 days. The news was about Iron Fang. It had moved south faster than the organizational version. The informal version always moved faster, traveler to traveler, market to market, built from fragments and partial information that accumulated into something roughly accurate through the sheer volume of its telling. The informal version said, the Alpha King of Iron Fang severed his bond at the Moon Altar and expelled his Luna before dawn 3 days ago. The same day, Iron Fang issued a military compact document declaring the expelled Luna a compromised party. The same day, the Alpha King announced a formal alliance with the Marrow territories. The farmer's wife delivered this information with the particular editorial quality of someone who found it interesting rather than significant, the way people discuss distant events that had not yet become personal. They say she walked out without a word, the farmer's wife said, setting bread on the table with the efficient movements of someone who feeds strangers frequently. The whole court watching and not a sound out of her. Is that so? Celine said. My cousin was in the capital for the campaign celebration, said the court talked about it for 2 days after, said it felt wrong the way she left, like the thing wasn't done. She shrugged. Courts are strange. Men like to think they've ended something, and sometimes what they've actually done is start something. Celine ate her bread. What do people here think of the military compact document? She said. The farmer's wife made a sound that was not quite dismissive, but was in the vicinity. Renwater acknowledged it because Renwater always acknowledges Iron Fang because they owe Iron Fang 3 trade concessions from the last border dispute. Halvern acknowledged it because Halvern is afraid. The rest are watching. She looked at Celine with the frank assessment of a woman who had been watching strangers come through her territory for years and had developed accurate instincts. You're asking because it affects you. Celine held her gaze. I'm asking because I'm traveling south, and I want to know which roads are complicated. The farmer's wife considered this answer for a moment and decided to accept it, because she was a practical woman and the coin Celine had given her was good coin. Stay off the Renwater Road, she said. The Halvern Road is clear for now, but I'd move fast on it. Everything else is open until someone makes a formal decision, and formal decisions take longer than rumors. Thank you, Celine said. She meant it. On the 3rd day they reached Aldrich. The Calver safe house looked the same as it had 4 days ago. The cooperage smell, the nondescript entrance, the carefully ordered small room. But when the door opened, it was not Aldrich who opened it. It was Tor, the younger man who had first found Aldrich, and his face carried the particular expression of someone who has been sitting with bad news and is relieved to have someone to give it to. Where is he? Celine said. He's here. He's fine. Tor stepped back. There's someone else. She went through the door. Aldrich was at the table, the gray-haired stillness of him unchanged. But across from him sat a man she had not seen in 8 years and would not have recognized on the street, but recognized here, in this context, with the specific certainty of someone encountering a thing they have been building toward. The man was in his early 30s, dark-haired, with the lean build of someone who had spent years doing outdoor physical work, with hands that confirmed it, calloused, precise, the hands of a man who worked with tools on terrain. He was looking at her with the same fixed quality that Aldrich had shown at the Calver door, the quality of encountering something you have prepared yourself for and finding it more real than the preparation. His name was Cale Vance. His father had been the 3rd seat of the Solarian High Council. He had received her letter in the West and had not waited 10 days. He had come in 3. You move fast, she said. I've been waiting for 8 years, Cale said. 3 days isn't fast. 3 days is the most patience I had. She sat down at the table. For a moment no one spoke, and in the silence she took the full measure of what was in the room. A council secretary with letters of establishment and 8 years of faithful waiting, a bloodline heir who had traveled 3 days on the strength of a 2-sentence letter, and herself expelled, targeted, with a compromised network and a checkpoint she had barely avoided, and a foundation that was smaller than she had planned for, but possibly intact enough to build from. Tell me what you know, Cale said. I know a great deal, she said. Some of it is now uncertain. Tell me what you brought. Cale reached inside his shirt and produced a leather folder, worn smooth at the edges, and set it on the table. She opened it. Land surveys, detailed ones, the kind produced by someone who surveyed professionally and understood terrain as a language. The Vethran Valley, drawn in a hand she recognized as recent, within the last 2 years, with annotations about defensive positions, water sources, road access points, and structural assessments of the existing buildings. He had been surveying the valley for 2 years. She looked up from the folder. You knew about Vethran, she said. My father talked about it before he died, before the massacre. He said if the worst happened, Vethran was the site. The geography is defensible, the trade access is significant, and it's in the contested zone where no single kingdom has jurisdictional priority. He looked at her. I've been waiting for someone to tell me the worst had happened and what we were building in response to it. She looked at the survey maps and the letters of establishment and the gray-haired man who had kept faith for 8 years, and the younger one who had been surveying a site he believed in without knowing if anyone would ever come for it, and she let herself understand the full shape of what was in this room. This was the foundation. Not what she had been building in the secondary channel network that as old as people had been reading for 14 months. Not the administrative intelligence she had accumulated in Iron Fang's wall. This room, these people, these documents, and these maps. This was the thing she had been building without knowing she was building it, through the choices she had made about what to protect and who to trust, and what to hold in silence, even when she could have used it. "There's something you need to know," she said, "about the situation." She told them. Not everything. She was a person who never told everything in one session, because that was how you remained indispensable and how you protected information that needed to stay held longer than one conversation. But enough. The secondary network compromise, the checkpoint, the military compact document in 17 kingdoms, the scope of Isolde Marrow's preparation, the 14 months of surveillance, the understanding that they were not operating against a reactive opponent, but a prepared one. When she finished, Aldrich was quiet in his particular way. Cale was looking at the table. "How much time?" Cale said. "Before Iron Fang moves directly against Vethran." "I don't know if they know about Vethran. If they don't, we have significant time. If Karev's access extended further than I currently believe, we have less." "Can you find out?" Aldrich said. "I have one channel left that isn't compromised," she said. "The primary network through Dava Helm. I sent the warning to Greven through it. If Greven is still operational, he has more current intelligence on what Iron Fang's people are doing in the south than I do." "Can we reach him?" Cale said. "I sent a warning to move 3 days ago. Whether he moved in time depends on variables I don't control." She paused. "We have to operate assuming I may no longer have access to Greven." The silence that followed was the silence of people recalculating in real time. She looked at Cale's survey maps. She looked at Aldrich's letters of establishment. She thought about Dava Helm at the Renner's Cross Courier Depot and the agreement they had made about Vethran, and she thought about the farmer's wife, who had said that formal decisions take longer than rumors. And she thought about the 17 kingdoms, in which 13 had not yet acknowledged the military compact. "I need to make contact with 3 kingdoms that have not acknowledged the compact," she said. "Kingdoms that are either neutral on Iron Fang or hold grievances against it. I need to approach them not as an expelled Luna, but as the last surviving principal heir of the Solaran bloodline with letters of establishment, a legal claim under the old Interkingdom Accords, and a site in the contested zone that represents a trade route strategic opportunity." Aldrich looked at her across the table. "That's a significant approach to make without a standing domain." "I know," she said. "It's also the approach that has to be made before Iron Fang reaches the kingdoms first and closes the window." She met his eyes. "The compact document gave me 17 kingdoms as the audience. 13 of them have not yet decided what it means. I need to be in front of 3 of them before they do." "And if they refuse," Cale said. "Then I have a different problem," she said. "But right now the problem in front of me is reaching them while the window is open, and that requires moving in the next 72 hours. Cale looked at his survey maps. He looked at the letters of establishment in their folded packet on the table. He looked at Celine with the eyes of a man who had waited 8 years and was now being asked to stop waiting. "I have contacts in the Halvern administration," he said. "Professional ones, from the surveying work. Nothing political, but access." "That's enough to get a meeting," she said. "Halvern is one of the 13, Aldrich said. "I know," Celine said. "That's why I need Cale's contacts." She was already moving, in the way she moved when the landscape had shifted under her, and the only option was to shift with it faster than it was moving, her mind reorganizing the inventory, the resources, the timeline, the approach. She was working with less than she had planned for. The foundation was smaller. The exposure was higher. The opponent was more capable and more prepared than her most pessimistic assessment had allowed. She was also, for the first time in 3 years, exactly herself. Not the plain Luna, not the discarded wife, not the woman performing smallness to survive inside someone else's walls. She was the thing she had been building toward in the years of silence and the dispatches and the letters and the watch over the stable yard. And she was building from what remained after the worst night of the plan, and the thing that had been building in her chest for all of it. Not anger, not grief, but the specific quality of someone who had been forced to stop being anything other than exactly what she was was now the only resource she had left that was completely intact. It was enough. It was going to have to be enough. She looked at Cale Vance and Aldrich Voss across the table in a Cooperage safe house in Calver, with the letters of establishment between them and the survey maps of a valley neither of them had seen yet, and she said the thing that the situation required. "We move tonight," she said, "and we do not stop." Neither of them argued, which told her everything she needed to know about whether the foundation could hold what she was about to build on it. She reached inside her coat and touched the worn fold of the message she had been carrying since Weimar, the 2 words she had written on the back. "Come home." She had written it thinking of an arrival, a destination, a place to return to. She understood now that she had the verb backwards. Home was not a place she was going. Home was what she was going to build, on the bones of a valley in contested territory, with letters 8 years old and a surveyor's maps and an old man's kept faith. And there was no checkpoint ahead of her now that she was going to ride around. She was going through, every one of them, until something she built was standing on the other side. The Halvern delegation arrived at the Vethron Valley post station on the 43rd day after Celine left Ironfang, and they arrived not as Cale's professional contacts offering a quiet administrative meeting, but as a formal party of 7, with a herald, which meant someone inside the Halvern court had already made a decision about what this meeting was before they attended it. Celine watched them come down the valley road from the upper floor of the post station, which Cale's survey maps had told her was the best observation point in the structure, with a clear sight line to the road for a half-mile in both directions. She watched the herald's banner and the formal arrangement of the party. 2 mounted guards front, 3 officials mid, 2 mounted guards rear. And she read the protocol of it the way she read everything, which was completely. Halvern had sent a recognition party, not a preliminary inquiry. A recognition party with herald and protocol formation, which under the old Inter-Kingdom Accords was the specific formal arrangement used when a sovereign power was acknowledging the legal standing of another party for the first time. They had reviewed the letters of establishment. They had already decided. She turned from the window and went downstairs. 43 days had built the post station from an abandoned structure into something that functioned, if not yet fully as what it was going to become, then at least as proof that becoming was underway. Cale's survey precision had made the structural assessment accurate enough that they had not wasted a day on problems that turned out to be different from what the maps indicated. The 3 road junctions that fed through the valley were cleared and marked. Davahelm's primary channel relay had established 2 stops in the valley within the first week, which meant information moved through Vethron now in both directions, which meant the valley was already on the map of the things that mattered to the people for whom information movement was commerce. Aldrich had been invaluable in ways she had not fully anticipated. His knowledge of the old Solaren administrative systems was practical rather than nostalgic. He knew which structures had worked and which had failed, and he applied that knowledge to the building of new ones with the efficiency of someone who had spent 8 years thinking about what he would do if he ever had the chance. He was not sentimental about the past. He was interested in what it could build. Celine had worked alongside both of them every day for 43 days, and she was tired in a different way than she had ever been tired inside Ironfang's walls. The Ironfang tiredness had been the tiredness of compression, of holding herself smaller than she was, constantly, the energy expenditure of that sustained performance. This tiredness was different. It was the tiredness of full extension, of being exactly as large as she was, and discovering that large had a cost as well as a compensation. She was not going to stop. She met the Halvern delegation in the main room of the post station, which they had furnished practically. A table, chairs, the fire going, because it was the end of autumn now, and the valley held the cold. Aldrich was beside her. Kael was at the table already, standing, because his contacts in the delegation included the senior official, a woman named Prieth, who had used his surveying services for Halvern border assessments, and who had, apparently, trusted him enough to carry his message into the right rooms. Prieth was in her 50s, with the weathered competence of a senior administrative official who had outlasted multiple political changes by being more useful than she was threatening. She looked at Celine the way people looked at things they had been briefed about and were now calibrating against the briefing. "The letters are authentic," Prieth said, without preamble, which was itself a signal. No pleasantries meant they were past the part where pleasantries were useful. Halvern's legal counsel reviewed them for 3 days. The seals are original. The provenance chain is intact. "I know they're authentic," Celine said. I need to know what Halvern intends to do about it. Priath looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had expected a more diplomatic opening and was recalibrating to a faster pace. Halvern intends to formally acknowledge the Solarian Compact claim, Priath said. Contingent on 2 other kingdoms doing the same, because 3 acknowledgements are required under the old accords, and we are not going to be the only name on a document that Iron Fang subsequently contests. Who are the other 2? Selene said. That's what we came to discuss. They discussed it for 4 hours. The Halvern delegation had done significant preparation. They had mapped the 13 non-acknowledging kingdoms against their current relationships with Iron Fang, against their historical positions on the Solarian Compact, against their trade interests in the contested zone. They had identified 3 candidates beyond Halvern itself, who had the combination of grievance against Iron Fang, historical neutrality on Solarian matters, and self-interest in the Vethran trade routes sufficient to make acknowledgement a rational choice. Selene worked through their analysis with the attention she brought to intelligence reports, which meant she identified the gaps as well as the substance. The gaps were in the relational mapping. Halvern had assessed the 3 candidate kingdoms based on public positions and formal diplomatic records, which was a reasonable foundation, but missed the informal dynamics that she knew from 3 years of reading Iron Fang's intelligence dispatches. She had better information on 2 of the 3 kingdoms than Halvern's analysis reflected. She used it. By the end of the 4 hours, they had a sequence. Halvern would formally dispatch acknowledgement of the Solarian claim pending parallel action from Keswick and Dorn, both of whom had specific grievances against Iron Fang that Selene's information made approachable in ways that Halvern's public record analysis had not seen. Selene would send direct approaches to Keswick and Dorn within the week, through channels she controlled, with information that would make the rational case for acknowledgement in terms specific to each kingdom's situation. When the Halvern delegation rode back up the Valley Road, Selene stood at the window again and watched them go, and Aldrich came to stand beside her. 3 acknowledgements, he said. If Keswick and Dorn come through, she said. They'll come through, Aldrich said. He said it without sentiment, which was why she believed it. He had been watching kingdoms make decisions for 40 years, and he knew what rational self-interest looked like when it was properly framed. Then we have a legal domain, she said. We have a legal claim to a domain, Aldrich said. The difference matters. I know, she said. The claim becomes the domain when there's something standing on it. She turned from the window. There was something standing on it. Not enough yet, but the beginning of something. The valley was inhabited now. 12 people, between herself and Kale and Aldrich, and the 4 workers they had brought in for the structural rehabilitation, and the 2 Dava Helm relay operators, and the 3 guards that Kale's Halvern contacts had quietly arranged. Not an army, not a court, but the beginning of a population, which was the most basic component of a domain. The letters went to Keswick and Dorn within 4 days. Selene wrote them herself, in the specific register that each kingdom required. Keswick's approach built around the trade route mathematics, the specific calculation of what Vethran Valley access was worth to a kingdom whose current routes ran 2 days long. Dorn's approach built around the border dispute with Iron Fang from 6 years ago that had never been formally resolved and that the Solarian Compact's contested zone provisions could address in Dorn's favor. She wrote both letters with the accumulated knowledge of 3 years inside Iron Fang's intelligence apparatus and the specific information she had extracted from those 14 months that Isolde's surveillance had inadvertently confirmed was accurate, because information that had been read by a sophisticated intelligence operation and not acted against was information that the operation had assessed as genuine. Isolde had given her a reliability check she had not anticipated. She found this almost amusing, in the dry way that the situation occasionally permitted. Keswick responded in 11 days. Dorn in 14. Both acknowledgements. On the 58th day after the moon altar, Selene stood in the main room of the Vethran post station while Aldrich read the formal language of the 3 acknowledgement documents aloud in the old Accord's required format, with Kale and the 12 people who now constituted the valley's population as witnesses. The Oraline Dominion came into legal existence on a cold afternoon in a repurposed post station that smelled of new timber and old stone, with no ceremony beyond the reading of documents and the signatures of witnesses, and the fire going because the valley was cold. Selene signed her name at the bottom of each document in the hand she had always used. Not her Iron Fang name, which had been Vyra, but her full name, which almost no one living had ever seen written, Celine Arin. The last name was not invented. It was the name her parents had carried before the massacre required her to carry something else, something that would not flag recognition in the court records of the kingdoms that had wanted the Solaran line ended. She had been carrying it for 8 years. She put it on the documents and let it be what it was. The next 6 months were the hardest work she had ever done, harder than 3 years of sustained performance inside Iron Fang's walls, because building was a different order of difficulty than surviving. Survival had a clear metric. You were alive or you were not. Building had 100 metrics, and they were all in motion simultaneously, and the failure of any one of them affected all the others. Trade came first, because trade was the mechanism through which everything else became sustainable. Deva-Helm's relay network through the valley was the initial infrastructure. Information movement was a form of commerce, and the operators paid a station fee, and the fee was small, but it was real income, and real income attracted the attention of the merchants who used the relay, and merchants who moved through a location regularly became the foundation of a market. The first market day in Vethrin Valley happened on a gray morning in early winter, with 11 merchants, 4 of them regulars from Deva's relay routes, and 7 of them new, drawn by the posted notice that the Valley Junction was open for trade. By the third market day, there were 23 merchants. By the 6th, 40. Kale's survey maps became construction plans. The post station expanded. 3 buildings went up around it, rough and functional, which was the right priority. Function first, form when the function was stable. 2 families from the Grey March forest margin moved into the valley in the 2nd month, drawn by the work. Then 4 more. Then a small flood of them in the 3rd month, because the word had traveled that there was a place in the contested zone where you could work and be paid and not live under the jurisdiction of a lord who owed Iron Fang trade concessions. The people who came to Vethrin were not by and large people who had been doing well where they were. They were people who had been managed and taxed and conscripted and told what they were worth, and had decided at various breaking points that what they were worth might be something different in a different place. Celine understood them because she was one of them, and she made decisions about the valley's administration with that understanding as the operating principle rather than an afterthought. The administrative structures she built were designed to do one thing that most imperial structures did not do, which was make the people inside them want to stay. Not through dependency. Not through the managed scarcity that kept populations too tired to leave. Through the specific practical recognition that people who chose to be somewhere built it differently than people who were trapped there. Aldrich watched her build it and said, one evening when they were both tired and the fire was low and there was nothing politically freighted about the moment, "Your mother would have built it this way." She looked at him. "You knew her," she said. "I worked with the council for 11 years, he said. "I knew everyone. Your mother was on the trade committee for 6 of those years. She argued constantly with the others about the administrative philosophy. They wanted to manage populations. She wanted to recruit them." He paused. "She was usually in the minority." "She was right," Celine said. "She was always right," Aldrich said. "That was part of why they had such trouble with her." She sat with that for a long time after he went to bed, the fire burning down to coals, the valley quiet outside the window with the winter dark, full and deep. Her mother had been right, and it had not saved her, and the people who had been wrong had not been punished for being wrong. They had simply been wrong in a way that coincided with having enough force to survive it, which was the particular dark arithmetic of power that most accounts of history preferred to obscure beneath the language of inevitability. Nothing about it had been inevitable. It had been a choice, made by specific people for specific reasons, and those people were still alive. And Celine had spent 6 months building something in a valley and had not yet addressed the fact that the people who had engineered the massacre were still operational. She was going to have to address it. The intelligence from Grevan, when it came, and it came eventually because Grevan had received her warning through Deva's network in time and had executed the East Protocol successfully, confirmed what she had suspected about Isolde Marrow's operational history. Isolde was not simply an opportunistic war heiress who had found a good moment to approach Iron Fang. Isolde Marrow's family had been one of the primary financial backers of the massacre 8 years ago. The Duke of Marrow had provided the operational funding, routed through 3 commercial intermediaries, which was why it had not appeared in any of the records that survived, for the network of assassins that had moved through the Solaran territories on the night of the massacre. The Duke had done this not out of personal animosity toward the Solaran line, but because the Solaran Compact's trade route provisions had been cutting into the Marrow coastal port revenues for a decade, and the Duke had made a businessman's calculation about the cost of removing the inconvenience versus enduring it. 8 years later, Isolde had moved against the only surviving principal heir of the line her father had paid to end. Not because she knew Selene was in Ironfang specifically. The Greven intelligence suggested Isolde had identified Selene as the probable heir through the same intelligence mapping that had found the secondary channel network over the same 14 months. She had been closing down the loose end her father had left. Selene read Greven's report on a morning in the 4th month of the Oraline Dominion's existence, sitting at the desk in the room that had become her working space in the expanded post station, and she held the information with the particular stillness that came when you received something that confirmed the worst shape of a thing you had partially known. Isolde had not been an opponent who arrived with Veilor's ambitions. She had been hunting Selene for 14 months, and she had nearly finished the job. What saved Selene was not strength. What saved her was patience and the accident of the secondary network not being the only thing she had built. Isolde had burned the secondary channel and driven Selene out of Ironfang and issued the military compact document, and she had done all of it correctly, and it had still not been enough because Selene had also been doing the parts Isolde could not see. The parts that lived in a coat lining for 8 years. The parts that surveyed a valley for 2 years without knowing why. The parts that were quiet and patient and accumulated in the dark. She was done being quiet. The decision was not angry. That was the thing she noticed about it when she sat with the Greven report on the cold morning. It was entirely clear. Not hot. Not the sharp reactive thing that anger was. Cold and clear and specific. The kind of decision that lived in the body as much as the mind, in the set of the shoulders and the steadiness of the hands. She folded the report. She called Aldrich and Kale to the working room. Isolde Marrow's family funded the massacre, she said. She did not say it to shock them. She said it because they needed to know, and because they were the two people who had the most right to that knowledge, and because what came next required them to know. The silence in the room had a particular quality. Kale was very still. He had his father's hands, the surveyor's precise hands, and they were flat on the table in front of him, and the stillness of them was not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of something in the process of becoming a different shape. Aldrich was looking at the wall. His expression was the expression of a man encountering a thing he had suspected and not wanted to confirm. "How certain is this?" Aldrich said finally. "The financial routing is documented. Greven has the intermediary records. It's as certain as anything that was designed to be unverifiable." "Veilor doesn't know," Kale said. It was not a question. "Veilor is building an alliance with the daughter of the man who funded the operation. No, he doesn't know." Kale looked at her. "You're going to tell him." "I'm going to do more than tell him," she said. "But first I need to understand what the Summit of Sovereigns is going to look like." The Summit of Sovereigns was the formal annual gathering of the continent's ruling powers, scheduled for 3 months hence, and it was the reason everything that came next had a natural stage. Halvern had already indicated, through Prieth's channels, that the Oraline Dominion would receive a formal invitation. The 3-acknowledgement threshold under the old accords created the obligation of invitation, regardless of Ironfang's position. It was law, not politics, which meant Ironfang could contest it, but could not simply refuse it. Selene was going to walk into the Summit of Sovereigns as High Queen of the Oraline Dominion. She was going to walk into the same room as Veilor Draven for the first time since she had walked the length of his throne hall without speaking. And she was going to do it with Greven's financial documentation in her hands, and 6 months of a functioning domain behind her, and 3 kingdom acknowledgements under the old accords, and the letters of establishment that Aldrich had kept alive for 8 years. She had 3 months. She used every day of them. The summit was held in the neutral city of Vareth, on the border of 4 kingdoms, in a hall built specifically for the annual gathering of powers, and therefore deliberately palatial in the uncommitted way of spaces designed to belong to no one. Selene arrived the day before the formal proceedings began, which was the correct tactical timing, early enough to assess the room's configuration, and the other attendees' positioning before the formal stage required her to perform rather than observe, late enough to avoid the extended diplomatic social period that preceded the summit, and in which informal hierarchies got established in ways that were hard to undo. She arrived with Aldrich, Kale, and 4 guards that Kale's Halvern contacts had arranged. Professional, discreet, competent, the specific kind of quiet that distinguished people who were actually capable from people who wanted to appear so. She wore armor, not court dress. Armor, silver moonsteel, a material she had chosen specifically because moonsteel was the traditional Solaren alloy, the material that every court scholar in the continent would recognize as the marker of the bloodline. It was not subtle. It was not designed to be. She had spent 3 years in Ironfang being deliberately unsubtle about nothing, managing her visibility down to near invisibility, and she was done with that calculation. She wanted to be seen. She wanted the room to understand exactly what was walking into it. The crown was white crystal, carved from a deposit in the Vethrin Valley's eastern ridge that Kale's survey had identified in his 2nd year of mapping the location. A deposit that had no name in any current cartography, which meant it was one of the valley's undocumented resources. And when Kyle had described it to her, she had understood immediately what it was for. The crystal caught light in a particular way, refracted it, distributed it across a wider angle than any metal would, so that the crown seemed to generate its own luminosity rather than simply reflect what was around it. In a torchlit hall, it was extremely visible. She was told later that the hall went quiet in a specific way when the golden doors opened for her entry. She did not need to be told. She felt it. The quiet moved in front of her through the assembled monarchs and lords and generals like a pressure wave, and she walked through it at a measured pace and registered the room the way she always registered rooms. Completely. Taking in the positions and expressions and the small physical adjustments that people made when encountering something unexpected. Valor was on the right side of the hall. She did not look directly at him in the first pass. She let the room's attention do what it was doing, which was redistributing itself toward her, away from the hierarchies that had existed in the room before she entered it, and she went to her designated position and turned to face the assembly. Then she looked at him. He looked like a man absorbing an impact in slow motion. She had prepared herself, in the weeks before the summit, to feel something when she saw him. She had thought it might be the anger, finally surfacing in its full form. She had thought it might be grief, which she had not allowed herself to fully feel in the months of building, because grief was not useful in the acute phase, and she had been in the acute phase for 6 months. What she felt was something else. She felt the specific completeness of a thing that had been in process for a long time arriving at its natural point. The way a calculation feels when the final variable resolves, and the answer is exactly what the work required it to be. He had discarded her, and she had built something that made that decision the most significant strategic error of his reign, not for satisfaction. She had told Aldrich the truth about that long ago. Watching Valor comprehend his mistake was not the victory. The victory was the domain behind her, the valley, and the people in it, and the 3 acknowledgments, and the letters, and the old man's kept faith, and the surveyor's 2 years of mapping a valley because his father's instincts had been right about the terrain. The victory was what she had built. Vialor was simply the audience for it. The formal proceedings began. She presented the Orline Dominion's legal standing under the old Inner Kingdom Accords. Aldrich had coached her on the specific procedural language for a week before the summit, and she delivered it with the precision of someone who understood that law was a language, and you had to speak it correctly for it to function. The 3 acknowledgments were read into the record. The letters of establishment were entered as supporting documentation. The legal council of 4 different kingdoms examined them in the 2 hours of formal review that the accords required. No challenge succeeded. The Orline Dominion was recognized by the Summit of Sovereigns before the first day's proceedings ended. Valor did not challenge directly. She had known he would not in the formal proceedings, because formal proceedings were not his element and he knew it, and because challenging the letters of establishment required legal grounds he did not have. He sat through the proceedings with the controlled expression of a man managing an extremely significant recalibration of his understanding of his situation, and she watched him do it from across the hall with the attention she had always given him and the new quality in that attention that came from not being required to hide it. The evening reception was where it happened. Receptions after summit proceedings were designed for exactly this, the informal rearrangement of relationships that the formal proceedings had restructured. The room was full of monarchs and their advisors recalibrating, approaching the new power configuration with the careful social footwork of people who understood that how you positioned yourself in the first hours after a significant shift determined a great deal about what came after. She was approached by 11 different parties in the first hour. She handled each of them with the economy she had learned in 3 years of court management and refined in 6 months of building. Enough engagement to register the relationship, enough brevity to maintain the position of someone whose attention was a resource being carefully allocated. Valor found her when the room had thinned enough to approach without it being a public spectacle. He came without attendance, which told her something. He had chosen this as a private conversation, not a political performance, which meant some part of him understood that what he needed from her was not something that could be achieved in front of witnesses. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. He looked the way she had only seen him look once before, in the corridor outside the throne hall on the night of the victory celebration, when she had told him about Isolde's port litigation, and he had given her the 12 minutes of genuine attention. He looked like a man who had walked into a room without his certainty, which for Valor Draven was a condition so unfamiliar it read on his face as something approaching pain. "I was wrong," he said. The simplicity of it was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for something more managed. The political framing, the calculated admission designed to open negotiation. What he said was just the fact, stated with the flat directness of a man who had been raised to never admit it, and was doing so anyway. "About what specifically?" she said. "Don't," he said. "I'm not mocking you," she said. "I'm asking. You were wrong about several things, and I need to know which one you've arrived at." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. The old tells were still there. The right hand opening and closing, the slight forward tilt of someone working a problem in real time. "About what you were," he said. "About what you were doing. About what that meant." "And Isolde," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "What about Isolde?" he said. "Her father funded the Solaran massacre," Celine said. 8 years ago. The financial records exist, Greven has them." The silence that followed was one of the most particular she had ever produced in another person. She watched Valor process it. She watched the sequence of it, the initial flatness of disbelief, then the specific quality of a man running the implications, then something that was not quite shock but was in the territory of it. The kind of impact you absorb when an understanding you have been building on turns out to have been built on nothing. "That's not possible," he said. "I'll send you the documentation tomorrow morning," she said. "I don't make that claim without it." "She's been inside my war council for 6 months," he said. "I know," Celine said. "She's been mapping your military structure since the first week. The alliance she proposed was always intended to deliver Iron Fang to the same people who funded the Solaran massacre, through a different mechanism. Instead of assassins, a daughter. Instead of one night, several years." Valor was very still. She had prepared herself for this moment too, and found that the preparation had been accurate in the details and wrong about the emotional texture of it. She had expected to feel vindicated. What she felt was something closer to the tiredness that came after a very long piece of work finally resolving, not satisfaction exactly, but the specific relief of a weight that had been carried being set down. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because Isolde is going to move against you before you can move against her," Celine said. "She's been too deep in your war council for too long to survive your knowing what she is. She's been planning for this contingency. I don't know the timing, but I know she's not the kind of operator who leaves a backdoor unbuilt." "You could let it happen," Valor said. "I could," she agreed. "You'd have everything you need to absorb what was left of Iron Fang." "I would," she said. "If Iron Fang collapsed into chaos, the contested zone instability would destroy the Vithran trade routes for a generation. A dozen smaller kingdoms would fill the power vacuum and spend the next 20 years fighting over it. The people in my valley would spend the next 20 years inside someone else's war." She held his gaze. "I didn't build something to watch it drown in avoidable destruction." Valor looked at her with the expression she had seen only once before, in the corridor. The genuine attention, the real kind, the kind that came from a man who had stopped managing the situation and was actually in it. "What do you want?" he said. "Isolde removed," she said, "tonight if possible. Before she understands that you know." She paused. "And then a conversation about what comes next, which is a different conversation from what you're going to want to have and what I'm going to be willing to agree to, and which is going to require both of us to say true things that are not comfortable. Tonight, he said. She's here at the summit. She's in the East Wing. Her personal guard is 2 people, both of them Marrow-trained, which means they're capable, but they respond to personal threat patterns, not institutional ones. Your summit guard has 6 people stationed in the East Corridor. Valor looked at her. You've already assessed her position, he said. I arrived yesterday, Celine said. I assessed everyone's position. Something moved across his face that was not quite the closest thing she had ever seen to humor in him, but lived in the same general territory. I'll handle Isolde, he said. I know you will, she said. That part is straightforward. The part after, it is what requires the conversation. When, he said. Tomorrow, she said. After you've handled it, and after you've had the night to think about what I've told you without performing a reaction for an audience. She held his gaze one more time. And Valor, don't mistake this for forgiveness. This is what comes after forgiveness, which is a different thing entirely and takes longer. She turned from him and went back into the thinning reception room, where the remaining monarchs and their advisors were doing the slow final social work of the evening, and she carried the conversation with her the way she carried everything, completely, recording it, letting it settle into the larger picture. The larger picture was this. Isolde Marrow was in the East Wing of the Vareth Summit Hall with a 2-person personal guard, and she had been inside Iron Fang's war council for 6 months, and she was the daughter of the man who had paid for the Solaran massacre, and she did not yet know that Celine had survived, built a domain, achieved legal recognition, and walked into the Summit Hall this evening in silver moonsteel and white crystal. She did not yet know that the loose end her father had paid to eliminate was standing 40 feet away in the same room, but she would figure it out, and a competent operator who understood she had been exposed did not wait. Celine was still in the reception room when the sound came from the East Corridor. Not an explosion, not the crash of metal on stone. Something quieter and therefore worse. A short, sharp series of sounds that people who had not been near violence before would not have identified correctly, followed by silence. The reception room noticed it. A ripple of attention, heads turning, the body language of a room suddenly uncertain about whether to be alarmed. Celine was already moving toward the East Corridor door before the ripple reached the far side of the room because she had spent 6 months making decisions without the luxury of waiting to understand the full situation, and she had understood this situation before the sounds finished. Isolde had figured it out. Isolde had figured it out, and she had moved first. The East Corridor was white marble and torch-lined and wrong in a way that was visible before the details resolved. 2 of Valor's summit guards down, not dead but not functional, moved aside with professional efficiency, the corridor door at the far end swinging on its hinge. She turned. Kale was behind her, which meant he had been watching for exactly this from the moment she had started moving, which meant his instincts were better than she had fully credited. East Wing exits, she said. I mapped them this afternoon, he said. Go. He went. She went after him at a run, in silver moonsteel armor that was lighter than it looked because the Solaran alloy had been designed for exactly this, and she felt the armor's weight correctly calibrated for the first time since she had put it on. Not as statement, as function. The East Wing of the Vareth Summit Hall had 4 exits. Kale knew where all of them went. She was going to find out if Isolde Marrow was as good at leaving as she was at infiltrating. And she was going to find out if 6 months of building something from nothing had made her fast enough and hard enough and sufficiently done with the patience of the person she used to be to end this tonight. In the corridor behind her, the Summit Hall erupted. Ahead of her, somewhere in the torchlit passages of the East Wing, Isolde Marrow was running, and Celine Aurin, High Queen of the Auraline Dominion, last heir of a bloodline that had been paid to end, was no longer building. She was hunting. Kale knew the building the way he knew every piece of terrain he had ever surveyed, not as a map in his head, but as a set of decisions the original builders had made, the logic of which he could reconstruct in motion. He went through the East Wing at a pace that was controlled rather than panicked, which Celine matched, and he made 2 turns that were not the obvious turns, which told her he was cutting toward where Isolde would have to emerge rather than where she had gone. She has 1 functional exit from this wing that doesn't empty into the main courtyard, Kale said, not slowing. The main courtyard has summit guards on all 4 corners. She knows that. So she's going for the service passage at the north end, which comes out behind the stabling block. How far? 60 seconds ahead of us if she's moving fast, 30 if she's moving smart. Is she moving smart? She's been inside Iron Fang's War Council for 6 months, Kale said. Yes. They moved. The service passage door was heavy timber, older than the rest of the building, the kind of door that had been part of the original structure before the summit hall was built around it. It was standing open when they reached it, which meant Isolde had come through it recently enough that it had not swung closed. Cold air from outside, the smell of horse and hay, and the particular darkness of a stable block at night. Celine went through the door without slowing and came out behind the stabling block into the narrow alley between the structure and the perimeter wall. And she stopped. Not because she lost the trail, because Isolde was standing 10 feet ahead of her in the alley, and she was not running. She had a blade out. Single-handed, short, the kind of weapon that was for close quarters rather than distance, and she held it with the grip of someone who had been trained in its use rather than someone performing familiarity. She had assessed the exit, understood that the perimeter wall was not climbable in the time available, and made the decision that a competent operator made when running became less survivable than stopping. She had turned around. She looked at Celine with the expression of someone running a very fast calculation and not liking any of the outcomes. You survived, Isolde said. It was not an accusation. It was what it was, a statement of the fact that had restructured her situation. I did, Celine said. The secondary channel. I watched it for 14 months. I know. I should have moved sooner, Isolde said. Not self-recrimination, just the flat assessment of someone who had made an operational judgment call and was reviewing it in real time. Yes, Celine said, you should have. The alley was cold and dark, the torchlight from the stable block's side entrance casting a sideways orange light that caught the blade in Isolde's hand and the silver moonsteel on Celine's chest, and not much else. Kale was behind Celine. She could hear him breathe. She did not look back at him because she did not need to, and because she was not going to take her eyes off the blade. What happens now? Isolde said. You know what happens now, Selena said. I could tell you things, Isolde said, about the massacre, about who else was involved. There were more than my father. I know there were more than your father, Celine said. I've spent 6 months building the documentation. Isolde looked at her. The calculation was still running behind her eyes. The competent operator's continuous assessment of the situation, looking for the variable that changed the outcome. There's no version of this where you let me walk away, Isolde said. No, Celine said. Then we're doing this in an alley. You chose the alley, Celine said. You chose it when you moved against Valor's guards tonight. You understood what that meant. Isolde's expression shifted, something settling in it that was not resignation but was in the same general vicinity. The specific quality of a person who has spent their entire professional life making hard calculations, arriving at the last one. My father believed the Solarian line was genuinely dangerous to the stability of the continent, Isolde said. He wasn't wrong about the danger. He was wrong about the direction of it. Your father paid for the deaths of a great number of people, Celine said, including my mother, who was right about most of the things your father found inconvenient. I've thought about what I feel about that for a very long time, and I've arrived somewhere that is past the point where talking about it changes anything. Isolde looked at her for one more moment. Then she moved. She was fast, genuinely fast, the kind of speed that came from real training and real use, not the performative readiness that court guards often presented. She closed the distance in a single committed motion, blade angled for the gap between moonsteel plates at the shoulder joint, which was the correct target. She had assessed the armor accurately. Celine moved left, not away from the blade, into the arm that held it, inside the extension, which was the only place the blade could not reach. She got both hands on Isolde's weapon arm, felt the joint's resistance, applied force at the angle Kale had taught her in the 3rd month when she had decided that being capable of this was no longer optional, and Isolde's grip broke. The blade hit the alley stones. Isolde's response was immediate and correct. She transitioned to open hand, going for Celine's throat with her free hand and the leverage of her own body weight. She was taller, the leverage was real. Celine let it drive her back 1 step, 2, until she had the perimeter wall behind her, and used the wall the way you use something solid when you have run out of room to keep retreating. She stopped retreating. She absorbed the drive, felt the wall at her back like an answer to a question, and pushed. The reversal was not elegant. It was not a technique. It was the specific thing that happens when a person who has been backed into a corner decides that the corner is not where the fight ends. Isolde went to the alley floor. She was up in under 2 seconds because she was good, and for the next 40 seconds the alley was two people in close quarters who both understood what they were doing and what the outcome had to be. And it was not clean or cinematic or anything other than what it was, which was exhausting and painful and determined by the specific question of who wanted to keep going more. Celine had spent 8 months rebuilding from nothing. She had spent 6 months doing the hardest work of her life in the cold of a valley that was not yet a domain when she arrived. She had spent 3 years performing smallness inside walls that did not want her, and she had done it without breaking. And the thing that had not broken in her was not strength in the conventional sense, but the particular quality of someone who had been at the end of her available resources so many times that the end of available resources had stopped being a stopping point. Isolde ran out of the will to continue before Celine did. Not dramatically. It happened in the way that the end of things often happened. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulating weight of a situation that was no longer survivable, recognized by a body that had been trained to be honest about such things. Isolde was on the alley floor with Celine's knee on her chest and her weapon arm held immobile, and she was breathing hard and looking up at the dark sky above the alley, and she had stopped trying to change the situation. "Do it," Isolde said. Celine was breathing hard too. The moonsteel armor had done its work. She was not significantly damaged, but the exertion was real, and her hands were shaking slightly with the specific tremor of muscles that had been extended past their comfort. She looked at Isolde. She had thought, in the weeks before the summit, about this moment. Not the specific alley, not the specific mechanics. She had not known those. But the moment of consequence. What it would require from her, what she was willing to be. "Your father's records are in Greven's possession," Celine said. "Copies have been sent to Halvern, Keswick, and Dorn. The financial documentation for the Solaren massacre is no longer something that only I know about. You understand what that means." Isolde was looking at her with the particular attention of someone listening to the specific thing being said rather than the expected thing. "You're not going to kill me," Isolde said. "I'm going to do something that requires more from you," Celine said. "You're going to stand in front of the Summit of Sovereigns tomorrow morning and you're going to testify. All of it. Your father's involvement, the funding mechanism, the names of everyone else who contributed, everything. And if I refuse, then the documentation goes to every kingdom simultaneously and you spend the rest of your life being hunted by the families of everyone your father paid to destroy, without any protection from the Oraline Dominion or from Ironfang, which will no longer have reason to shelter you once Vaelor understands what you are doing inside his war council." Isolde looked at the dark sky for a moment. "And if I testify," she said, "then the documentation still goes to every kingdom," Celine said. "But you testify first, which means you control the narrative of your own involvement, and the kingdoms decide what that's worth. That is the only version of this conversation where the outcome is not entirely out of your hands." The calculation ran behind Isolde's eyes one more time. "You're not doing this for justice," Isolde said. "I'm doing it for accountability," Celine said. "They're related, but they're not the same thing." Isolde closed her eyes briefly. "All right," she said. Celine stood up from the alley floor and stepped back, and she felt the shaking in her hands and her legs, and she did not hide it, because there was no one in the alley to perform steadiness for except Kale, who was watching from the door with the expression of a man who had been prepared to intervene and had not needed to and was not entirely sure how to process that. She picked up Isolde's blade from the alley stones and held it. The blade was good steel, well balanced, the kind of tool that had been made for use rather than display. She turned it once in her hand and then handed it back to Isolde, hilt first. Isolde looked at her. "If you run," Celine said, "I will find you. Not because I enjoy it, because leaving this unfinished would cost people I am responsible for more than it would cost me." Isolde took the blade. She looked at it and then at Celine. "Your mother argued with my father at the trade committee," Isolde said. 3 times. I was 12. He came home furious each time. He said she was the most frustrating person he had ever negotiated with because she was always right, and she never seemed to need him to acknowledge it. Celine looked at her. "She was right about most things," Celine said. "I know," Isolde said. They went back inside. The Summit of Sovereigns convened an emergency session at dawn. Isolde testified for 2 hours. She did not flinch from it. Celine had assessed her correctly as a person of specific moral architecture, the kind that had done an indefensible thing in the service of a coherent goal and was capable of accounting for it precisely because the architecture was coherent rather than chaotic. She gave names, dates, financial routing, the specific operational decisions, and who had made them. 7 names emerged from the testimony beyond the Duke of Marrow. 4 of them were current lords or advisors in various kingdoms represented at the summit. The room was very quiet for most of the 2 hours. Vaelor was in the room. He had handled Isolde's personal guard the previous night. She learned the details later, from Kyle, who had circled back through the summit hall while Celine was in the alley, with the efficiency of a man who had spent his entire career in close-quarters situations, and who had been, it transpired, deeply and specifically furious. The kind of furious that comes from discovering that something you trusted has been built to destroy you, and that the person who told you was the person you had discarded. He sat through Isolde's testimony with the stillness of a man in the process of rebuilding his understanding of 6 months of his own history and not enjoying the process. When the testimony ended, the summit moved to formal proceedings. The 4 lords named in the testimony were detained pending investigation by their respective kingdoms. 2 of them wept. 1 of them argued procedural points until the presiding herald shut him down. 1 of them simply sat and looked at the table. The Duke of Marrow, who was not at the summit, would receive a formal multinational investigative commission within the month. The documentation went to every kingdom simultaneously at midday, as Celine had told Isolde it would, because a promise kept under difficult conditions was the only kind that meant anything. The formal session ended in the late afternoon. Celine sat in the chamber that had been assigned to the Oraline Dominion's delegation after the proceedings finished, with Aldrich and Kale, and she let herself be tired in the way she had not let herself be tired since the moon altar. The full weight of it. 68 days since expulsion, 6 months since founding, 8 years since the massacre that she had been living inside the consequences of without being allowed to name it as such. She had spent those months and those years building and surviving and performing smallness and navigating and calculating, and the calculation had resolved, and the outcome was what the work required it to be, and she was exhausted down to the marrow. Aldrich made tea. He had brought the materials, the same good tea, not the grain water substitute, because he had understood that they would need it, and because he was a man who expressed care in practical forms rather than sentimental ones. She held the cup and felt the warmth of it through her palms, and looked out the chamber window at the evening sky over Vareth, which was the deep blue of a winter evening that had gone clear after a cloudy day. "The 7 names," Kale said. He was sitting across from her, his surveyor's hands folded on the table. He had the quality he sometimes had of a person turning something over in his mind before he was willing to set it down as words. "I know," she said. "It's not over." "No," she said. "It's not over. The commission will take months. Some of the kingdoms with named lords will protect them. The legal process will be what legal processes are, which is slow and contested and not perfectly just. And the Duke. The Duke will have the best legal representation his ports can buy," she said. "He will possibly die of old age before the commission reaches a final conclusion." Kale looked at her. "You knew that before tonight." "I knew it," she said. "The choice was between that outcome, slow, contested, imperfect, institutional, and the alternative, which was doing it the way the massacre was done, which was fast and effective, and produced 8 years of exactly what we have been living in." She held the teacup. "Institutional accountability is not satisfying," she said. "It doesn't feel like justice in the moment. It is slower and less certain and frequently infuriating. But it is what produces something you can build on afterward, rather than something that requires another round of the same thing in another 8 years. Aldrich was watching her from his chair by the fire, with the expression he sometimes wore when he was recognizing something he had already known being stated as a principle. "Your mother said almost exactly that," he said, "in the council chamber, about a border dispute in the Eastern Territories. She said the satisfying choice and the right choice were usually not the same choice, and the work was learning to live in the gap between them." Celine looked at the evening sky. "She sounds like she was difficult," Celine said. "She was the most difficult person I've ever worked with," Aldrich said. "It took me 5 years to understand that difficult and right were the same word when applied to her." The door to the chamber opened. She knew who it was before she looked, because there was only one person at the summit who would come without announcement to a room that belonged to the Oraline Dominion, and only one person whose presence she had been aware of at the edge of her attention all day, the way you are aware of weather that has not yet broken. Valor came in. He looked at Aldrich and Cale with the expression of a man who was going to ask them to leave, and was managing the politeness of it. Aldrich stood before Valor said anything and took his tea and went. Cale followed. Neither of them looked at Celine as they went, which was the specific discretion of people who understood that what was about to happen in this room was not something that needed an audience. The door closed. Valor looked at her. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of the chamber with the particular quality she had seen in the alley conversation, the managed surface over something that was not managed, the king's posture containing something that was not the king's usual contents. She waited. She had learned how to wait. "The War Council records," he said finally. "I've been going through them since dawn. Everything Isolde had access to, the briefings she sat in on." He paused. "She knew our eastern positioning. She knew our supply route vulnerabilities. She knew the disagreement between Crest and the Second General about the Halrath border strategy." "I know," Celine said. "She was in those rooms for 6 months," he said. "Yes, she was in rooms I've never let anyone—" He stopped. "She was very good at what she did," Celine said. "I know what she was good at," he said, and something came into his voice that was not anger but was heat, the specific heat of a man who had prided himself on seeing threats clearly and had been comprehensively blind to one for half a year. "What I'm trying to understand is how I missed it." "You didn't miss it," Celine said. "She designed it so you wouldn't see it. That's different." "Don't," he said. "I'm not absolving you," she said. "I'm being accurate. You missed it partly because you weren't looking for it, and partly because she was skilled enough that most people wouldn't have caught it, even if they were looking. Those are both true simultaneously." He looked at her. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was holding something that he was not going to say immediately, the internal management of a man who had learned that expressing things prematurely cost him leverage, and had applied that lesson so consistently that he sometimes couldn't find the thing underneath the management. "I read the dispatch from 6 years ago," he said. "The one you would have seen in the administrative wing. The one about the eastern trade routes and the Marrowport revenues." She waited. "You knew then," he said, "about the Marrow connection to the massacre. You knew in the administrative wing, and you said nothing." "I didn't know then," she said. "I suspected something was wrong with the Marrowport situation. I had pieces of it. I didn't have the full shape until Grevin's intelligence confirmed it 6 months ago." "But you had pieces." "I had pieces that required more investigation before they meant what I thought they might mean," she said. "I was not going to bring you an accusation about a potential alliance partner without being certain. You would not have received it well." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I wouldn't have." The admission cost him something. She could see it cost him, not in the dramatic way of a man performing vulnerability, but in the small physical way of someone releasing a grip they have been holding for a long time. His shoulders changed, a fraction of an inch. Enough. "The map room," he said, "when you gave me the Ashvale information." "Yes." "I told you it wasn't enough to stop it." "You did." "I was right," he said. "It wasn't enough to stop it, but it was enough to buy 3 weeks, and you used those 3 weeks to—" He stopped again. The calculation was running behind his eyes, and she could see it arriving at the same destination it always arrived at when Valor Draven finally, slowly, looked at something he had been avoiding looking at. "You used those 3 weeks to send the letters that reached Aldrich." "And to begin the conversation with Dava Helm's network," she said. "Yes." He looked at the evening window. "You were already building it," he said. "While you were in my court, you were already building it." "I was building contingency," she said. "I didn't know what form it would take until the form became necessary." "There's a difference between contingency and what you built in 6 months." "The contingency became the foundation," she said. "The foundation became the domain. That sequence required time I had, and you didn't give me credit for spending." He turned back to face her. The thing she had been watching him contain all day was closer to the surface now, and she understood what it was. It was not guilt exactly, though guilt was part of it. It was the specific reckoning that comes to a person who has operated on the assumption that their judgment was reliable and has encountered irrefutable evidence that it wasn't, and who is honest enough to face that evidence rather than construct an alternative explanation for it. Valor Draven was many things, including a man who could be honestly wrong when the evidence was this comprehensive. I want to negotiate terms, he said, for what comes next, between Iron Fang and the Auraline Dominion. I know you do, she said. I'm asking you what you need from those terms. She looked at him. She looked at the man she had spent 3 years watching with the specific attention of someone who needed to understand the exact shape of a force they were living beside, and she saw what 6 months and this day had done to the shape of him. Not broken it. He was not broken. He would never be a man who broke in the way that some people broke, the kind of breaking that changed the fundamental structure, but altered, the way things were altered by encountering something they had not been built to handle and being honest about the encounter. I need Iron Fang's formal recognition of the Auraline Dominion's legal standing, she said. Not as a courtesy, as a formal treaty obligation registered with the summit. Done, he said. I need the military compact document withdrawn from the 17 kingdoms and formally rescinded. Done. I need access to Iron Fang's administrative records on the Solaran territories for the period prior to the massacre, not the military records. The civil administrative records, population, infrastructure, land title. The people who came to the Vethran Valley came from somewhere, and some of them have claims to lands that were absorbed into neighboring territories after the massacre. I intend to pursue those claims through the proper channels, and I need the documentation to do it. Valor looked at her steadily. That's going to be politically complicated for me, he said. I know, she said. I'm asking for it anyway. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. She nodded. The conversation about what else comes next, she said, is going to take longer than tonight. The trade route agreements, the border protocols, the military coordination, those are months of work, and neither of us should be making commitments on them tonight, because tonight has been a very significant day, and decisions made at the end of very significant days are not always the decisions you want to have made. That's practical, he said. I'm always practical, she said. You should have noticed that earlier. Something shifted in his face that was almost rueful. I noticed a great deal about you earlier, he said. I filed most of it in the wrong place. Yes, she said. You did. He moved to the window. He stood there for a moment looking at the same evening sky she had been looking at, the deep winter blue of it, and she let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not performative, just the silence of two people in the same room after an extremely long day, which was its own kind of communication. Celine, he said. She waited. The bond scar, he said. On your wrist. Her hand went to it involuntarily, the old unconscious gesture, the awareness of the place where the bond had been and where the severance had left its mark, cold and permanent. What about it? She said. Does it still hurt? The question was more direct than she had expected from him, more direct than she had expected from a man who had spent his entire life managing the gap between what he felt and what he showed. Not the way it did, she said. It's more that I notice it, the absence of it, the shape of the thing that was there. I have one too, he said. The severance leaves it on both sides. She had known that. She had known it intellectually, the way you know facts about processes you have not personally witnessed from both sides. She had not thought about what it meant that he was carrying it too. She looked at the back of his shoulder, where the equivalent mark would be under the dark fabric of his formal coat, and she thought about him waking on the morning after the moon altar in the throne room she had been expelled from and feeling the absence of the thing that had been severed, and she held that thought with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that were complicated enough to require it. I told you in the reception room, she said. This is not forgiveness. Forgiveness comes later, if it comes. What this is what comes after the acute phase. I know what you said, he said. I heard it. Then you know that I'm not offering you the thing you're asking about. I know that, he said. I'm not asking for it. He turned from the window. I'm asking because I needed to know if you were carrying it the same way I was. She held that. Why does it matter, she said. Because if you're not, he said, then I'm the only one in this room with something to repair, and that's a different situation than if we both are. She looked at him. The Alpha King of Iron Fang, feared across the continent, standing in the chamber of the woman he had expelled before dawn in a snowstorm, asking whether she was carrying the same wound he was, because the answer changed the nature of what came next. She had prepared herself to be unmoved by him. She had built that preparation carefully, over months, because she understood that the most dangerous form of the old pull was the subtle version. Not dramatic feeling, but the simple recognition of the person you had spent 3 years learning and the specific incompleteness of a thing that had not been finished. She was not entirely unmoved. She was moved in the way that she was moved by all things she refused to let move her into action she had not chosen, which was to say, it registered, it was real, and she was going to sit with it until she understood what it meant rather than acting on it before she did. "I'm carrying it," she said. "What either of us does about that is a question for a different day." He nodded, once. The simple acceptance of a man who had decided that pressing for more than he was being given tonight was not what this moment required. "A different day," he said. "Many different days," she said. "None of them tonight." He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "The valley," he said. "What you built in 6 months. I had reports. My intelligence south of the border. What was left of it after Isolde." He stopped and started again. "I had reports. The people in the valley. The market. The way it's organized." "What about it?" she said. "It doesn't look like what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "A stronghold," he said. "A fortification. Something built to demonstrate power." I built something built to sustain people," she said. "The demonstration comes from the sustaining." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that now," he said. "I didn't before." A pause. "I'm not certain I understand it fully now, but I understand that I didn't before." "That's enough for tonight," she said. He went. The door closed, and she sat in the chamber alone for the first time in what felt like a very long time, and she let herself do the thing she had not fully allowed herself to do since the moon altar, which was to be in the quiet without managing it. The fire Aldrich had built was burning low. The evening outside had deepened to full dark. Somewhere in the building she could hear the distant evidence of the summit in its aftermath. Doors, voices, the sound of a significant day continuing to reverberate through the people who had been inside it. She looked at the bond scar on her wrist. She had told Vialor it did not hurt the way it had. That was accurate. The acute pain of the severance was long past. It had faded in the first weeks, the specific cold of it fading into a faint awareness that lived in the bone rather than the surface. What remained was exactly what she had described to him, the shape of the thing that had been there, the outline of an absence. She had learned, in 6 months of building, that absence was not the same as emptiness. Absence was the negative space that defined the shape of what surrounded it. The valley had been an absence before it was a domain, an empty post station and an empty road junction and an absence of people. She had not filled it arbitrarily. She had built into its specific shape, according to what the terrain and the roads and the people required, and the absence had become a form. She thought about her mother, who had been right about most things and had died for it, and she thought about Aldrich, who had kept faith for 8 years in the specific stubborn way of someone who understood that faith was a practice rather than a feeling. She thought about Cale's surveyor's hands laying out maps of a valley he had never intended to stop mapping. She thought about Dava Helm at the courier depot, running a network that now ran through the Vethrin Valley, adding 2 days to nothing because the right post station was open. She thought about the farmer's wife at the edge of the Grey March forest, who had said that men like to think they've ended something, and sometimes what they've actually done is start something. She thought about the moon altar. She had not thought about it cleanly since the day it happened. There had been no time to think about it cleanly, and then she had made the deliberate choice not to, because thinking about it cleanly was not the same as thinking about it usefully, and she had needed to be useful for 6 months. She had stored it, carefully, in the place she kept things that required more than she could give them in the acute phase. She took it out now and looked at it. The hall full of people, the ceremonial armor, Isolde positioned to the right like a placement already decided, the elder's formal language filling the room with the sound of procedure, the cold of the severance in her wrist, and the walk, the full length of the hall, every face she had memorized, the court that had never seen her watching her go, and not a word from her, not a single word, because she had not been willing to perform for the audience and there had been nothing to say to a room that had already decided. She had not been wounded by the walk. That was the thing she had not admitted to herself at the time, because understanding it would have required her to understand things about the 3 years in Iron Fang that she had not yet been ready to understand. She had not been wounded by the walk, because she had already been somewhere else. She had been building for long enough that what happened at the moon altar was not the destruction of something, but the release of something. The end of the constraint that had required her to stay small in order to stay present. The walk had been the last act of the performance of smallness, the final scene of a 3-year role she had inhabited so completely, she had sometimes lost track of where the role ended and she began. The door opened. Aldrich. He came back to his chair by the fire, which was the right instinct. He had gone out when Valor came in, and he had come back when Valor left, without being told when either transition had happened, because he had spent 40 years learning how rooms worked, and he knew this one. He sat down and looked at the fire and said nothing for a while, which was also the right instinct. "The commission will be difficult," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. "Some of the names will be protected." "Yes," he said. "Some of them, not all." "Not all," she agreed. The fire shifted, a log settling. "You did it," Aldrich said. He said it simply, as a fact, not as celebration, the same way he said most true things. "We did it," she said. "No," he said. "I kept the letters for 8 years, and Kyle surveyed the valley, and Grivan ran a network, and Dava Helm built the relay. Those are contributions." He looked at her. "You held it together, all of it. When the secondary network burned and you were riding through a forest to avoid a checkpoint, you held it together. That's different." She thought about what holding it together had actually felt like. The cold forest floor, the inventory running in the dark, the anger burning clean, the decision at the river crossing to get the warning through before thinking about what came next, the specific quality of being past the point where falling apart was an option because there was no one else to hold the thing. "It's what you do when there's no alternative," she said. "That's when you find out what a person is made of," Aldrich said. "When there's no alternative. When the circumstances that made you feel secure are gone, and what's left is just you and the thing you have to do." He looked at the fire. The Solaran Council never faced that. They had 30 years of stability. They never had to find out. She sat with that. "And," she said quietly, "and it cost them," he said. "Not their goodness, not their principles, but the specific kind of hardness you develop when the alternative to developing it is losing everything." He was quiet for a moment. "You have it. You had to develop it in conditions that should not have been imposed on you. But you have it, and the domain you're building with it is going to be better than what was lost, because it's being built by someone who knows the cost of the thing." She held his words the way she held things she needed to think about longer than the moment allowed. "I'm going to make mistakes," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." "I already have." "Yes," he said. "And you're going to make more. The question is not whether you make them. The question is whether you learn the right things from them and keep building." He looked at her steadily. "The Solaran Council made mistakes. They didn't survive long enough to correct them. You will." Outside the summit hall, the night had gone fully dark and clear, and the Vareth city below the hall's windows was making the sounds of an ordinary evening in a place that had hosted an extraordinary day. The sounds of people going about the business of living in the aftermath of events that would take years to fully understand. She thought about the Vethran Valley, the market on its scheduled days, the families who had come through the Grey March margin, the road junctions cleared and functional, the letters of establishment in their legally registered form, entered into the summit's permanent record, the 3 acknowledgments that had made the domain real. She thought about what Valor had said. "It doesn't look like what I expected." She thought about what she had built and why it looked the way it did, and she arrived at something that was not quite a principle, but was in the same territory. The understanding that power built from genuine need, from the specific practical requirements of people who had chosen to be present rather than people who had been trapped into presence, had a different quality than power built from dominance and fear. It was more fragile in some ways. It required more maintenance. It required you to pay attention to the people inside it in ways that pure authority never required, because pure authority didn't care whether the people inside it wanted to stay. It was harder to destroy in other ways, because the people inside it were there by choice, and chose every day to keep building, and you could not simply break the thing at the top and watch it collapse, the way you could with a structure built on compulsion. She had not built it as theory. She had built it because she had understood, from watching Valor, what the alternative produced, and because the people who had come to the valley had taught her, through the specific way they worked and the things they built, and the choices they made with the autonomy she did not restrict, that given the conditions to grow into their full capacity, people grew. It was not complicated. It was just slow. She sat until the fire burned down to embers. Then she stood and went to the window and looked at the dark sky over Vareth, where the clouds had cleared completely and the stars were out in the dense winter pattern, and she looked at them for a long moment with the specific quality of someone looking at a thing they have looked at all their life and seen it slightly differently now. She was 26 years old. She had spent 8 years as the last surviving heir of a destroyed bloodline, 3 years in the court of the man who had expelled her, 6 months building a domain from a post station and a packet of old letters and 2 honest men who had kept faith with something that did not yet exist. She had 6 months of legal standing, a functional domain, 3 treaty acknowledgments, and a commission investigating the people who had funded the massacre of her family. She had a bond scar on her wrist and a conversation with Vaelor Draven that had ended with the words "many different days." She had an old man asleep in the chair by the dead fire who had carried faith for 8 years in a coat lining, and a surveyor somewhere in the hall who had mapped a valley for 2 years because his father's instincts had been right about the terrain. She had what was needed, not everything. Never. Everything. She understood now that everything was not a condition that obtained in the real world, that the work was always partial, and the domain was always in the process of becoming rather than arrived, and that the people who waited for everything before they began were the people who built nothing. She had what was needed. She looked at the stars for a long time. Then she went back to the desk, and in the cold quiet of the chamber with Aldrich sleeping, breathing in the background, she opened the correspondence she had been composing before the summit proceedings. The letters that needed to go out in the morning to the contacts in the 3 kingdoms whose lords had been named in Isolde's testimony, and she picked up the pen and she began to write. Not because the night demanded it, because the work was ongoing, and the morning came early, and there was a domain in a valley that needed its High Queen present in it, which meant the night was for preparation. In 3 days she would ride back to Vethrin. The valley would be there. The market, the families, the road junctions clearing now of the season's last snow, the first travelers of the new trading season already moving through. The Auraline Dominion. Small, contested, built from nothing in 6 months by 2 honest men and an old man's kept faith and her own specific stubbornness about what she was made of. Standing. She wrote until the candle burned low, and outside the summit hall the world continued its ordinary business, and the stars held their winter patterns above the Vareth rooftops. And for the first time in a very long time, Celine Arin, High Queen, heir, last and first of her line, wrote her real name at the bottom of a letter without pausing to consider what it cost. It cost nothing. It was simply what she was. And in the morning, when Vaelor Draven signed the formal recognition treaty across a table from her in the summit's official chamber, in front of every monarch on the continent and the full record of the proceedings, she signed her name in the same hand with the same steady grip, not as the woman he had expelled, not as the Luna he had failed to see, as the queen she had built herself into, in the months he had not been watching, in the silence he had mistaken for absence. The pen touched the paper. The ink was permanent. The signature was hers.